Bonjour.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us for this conference, this discussion on biodiversity. That won't be easy to answer to that issue. How can we bridge the worlds of living things? Thank you for being so numerous. Biodiversity is the living fabric of our world and universe. We'll take stock of this situation. We'll talk about the state of play with Pierre, who's going to be with me. We'll have the opinion of the Cercle des économistes on this subject. We have Olivier Ragnat, Cécile Belliot, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Bell Group, and Ominia and Mohamed Soalf, Chief Economist from the OCP Group. Loane Fontany, we would say it. It's time to take stock of this biodiversity. We need to have figures as well, because we know that this degradation is assessed, is quantified, and we need to take stock, a real stock of the situation. Yes, thank you, Audrey, for this introduction. I will try not to overwhelm you with figures, because in truth, we read very different figures, so you make me lie already. Yeah, I told you that I was someone wreathing havoc. So figures are very much different from one another, departing on the starting point, depending on the baseline. What was the biodiversity at moment A or B, then the figures would be different. I'm going to give you some ideas about the trends, the patterns, the underlying problems that underpin this trend, and I will give you food for thought, because it's not easy. Everybody has in mind, and it's recalled in the program, what this word means: biodiversity, which is a contraction of biology and diversity. What is important is diversity. From introducing geography in economists, they did actually take over with the geographers. I don't know if geographers would actually agree with me, but they said that variety and diversity are a source of wealth for consumption, for services, for components, suppliers, for companies. We can actually sketch out a model of this, and this is central to the economy nowadays. So let's go back to our diversity, namely biotopes. That concerns the diversity of environments, that concerns diversity of species within these environments, and then ultimately it concerns the diversity of individuals within each species, human species being one among others. This biodiversity is a warrant of productivity in agriculture, for the preservation of the food chain. That's also a reservoir for genetic know-how, for medicine, and that will help also for the adjustment of the cryosphere to climate change if things don't go too badly. Unfortunately, and this is where the bad news starts, we are testimony of a collapse of biodiversity, and I'm really highlighting that word. That's having massive artificialization of soils, pollution, and change of biodiversity. And also, someone will be surprised, it also comes from international trade when it's not well controlled and mastered. Some components are well mastered with control on phytosanitary products and so on, but there's also a lot of dimensions that are not well controlled in international trade, and that would entail to a loss of biodiversity. So you wanted figures. The figures that is 1 million species out of 6 will disappear tomorrow. That's already a done deal. 1 in 8 million. And half a million additional species will disappear altogether on top of the rest. So out of the 8 millions, actually, it's already a done deal. And I'm not going to talk about this because it's not my field. It seems that we are going to undergo the 6th mass extinction trend. We can count on civil society, we can count on NGOs, we can count on companies, but we are about to witness and to undergo a real disaster. And this is why it's so important. It's a matter of lack of collective action. Nothing can happen, nothing can be decided if we do not have a global agreement, because each benefits from the action of the others, but it is costly for each and every one. So why would I actually act if the collectivity doesn't benefit from it? So that means, should I buy a ticket to get into the bus? That's actually a collective benefit as well. And an aggravating factor, it's also a problem of intergenerational problem. If we lose biodiversity, we should work for our children, grandchildren. And it's very difficult to look ahead and talk about economic models when it's a matter of having an impact for the future generations to come. So the way in which the economists approach it, if they think that, it would be actually a good thing to look at the report that was drafted by Sir Descriptor in the United Kingdom, whom everybody know. It's a report that was commissioned by the British government. And what this shows, Boris Johnson said that it was a good report. So I don't know if it's good news or not. Well, it seems that he took the time to read it. It's very dense. It's 600 pages. I would recommend it to you. This report, Boris Johnson said it was a good report, and it says that the value of nature should be integrated into economic calculation and calculus. When we talk about GDP, we often say we're going to do 1%, 2% of GDP. The calculation of GDP in the way in which it is done actually has a wrong assumption to start. I have still 2 minutes, so I will stick to my time. Anyway, so we haven't given a value, a price, to the destruction of a natural resource. So we give a price to what we produce, but we don't put a price to what we destroy. And so the end result is fake. It's erroneous. It's a mistake when we make calculations like this, and we're trying to talk about the green PIP and so on. But we need to rethink the business model, when we need to measure how we increase wealth, because by doing so, we actually destroy natural wealth. And there's a lot of Parisians in this area, even though we are far from Paris. What is the value of the forest of Fontainebleau? Can you give a price to the Fontainebleau forest, for instance? That's a question that economists raised and addressed. And there's a lot of criteria. We could calculate the expenditure that the Parisians would incur in terms of fuel to go to the forest, all the hours they spend driving to the forest. That has an economic price. And if we add it all up with an updating value, then we could give a cost or price to the forest of Fontainebleau. It has, if we destroy it, however, it has a negative value, a negative cost that we should take into consideration. I'm going to give you 2 examples to show you that it's altogether very straightforward and very complicated. This forest of Fontainebleau is put in the report. Well, it's not per se, they do not speak about Fontainebleau, but they said, how about destroying a forest to create a supermarket? You would get into the GNP, you would get the price of the supermarket, but you wouldn't take into consideration the cost of destroying that specific forest. And going beyond this report, and that will be my conclusion, I will give you an example which is quite similar, but that doesn't have any obvious answer. Let's assume, and I'm thinking about our friends from Berlin, what if you destroy a forest to build a factory of electric cars that would allow you to curb climate change? Is it a good idea to destroy that forest or not? Or rather say it to some politicians from the Green Party there that have some ideas on that subject. So the economic calculation about destroying natural resources, it has a price. And we are at a loss here. Economists are at a loss, but they still talk about it. Indeed, that gives us venues for thought. We already have the impact about human health. You were talking about generation, about intergenerational principles. This is with you, Inonia. We talked about health during, we are at the very heart of the subject. That's the interdependence of human health and biodiversity and health consequences that it can entail, and the commitment of young generations for this biodiversity.
Hear me? Yes. Bonjour. I'm very sorry to be speaking in English, but I hope you can understand. So thank you so much. And I'm here to talk more about biodiversity and how it impacts people. We know that the reality that we are living in right now is a combination of climate change, biodiversity loss, and toxic pollution. And this is what we call as the triple planetary crisis. As it was mentioned, we are at a crash course towards a big disaster. And we know that in 2015 in Paris, we had the Paris Agreement, and we were looking towards a 1.5 degrees increase. Now, in 2023, we are at 1.45. And what does that mean for biodiversity, and what does that mean for human health? Biodiversity affects human health through a diversity of ways, both our physical health, but also our mental health. When it comes to physical health, we know biodiversity loss is linked to malnutrition that we are seeing right now. Just in 2021, over 120 million more people are suffering from hunger, malnutrition, and acute food insecurity. And this is particularly affecting children and young people, which has detrimental impacts on their growing brain and their body. But also when it comes to the diseases that are linked to biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, 80% of these diseases lead to the mortality, to the death, and the morbidity of children under the age of 5. So you can see the intergenerational injustice that is linked to biodiversity and children's health. We can also see that because of biodiversity loss, because of human activities that lead to biodiversity loss, whether it is deforestation, whether it is unsustainable agricultural practices and the crops that are being used but they are damaging the environment that is being used, this brings more zoonotic diseases and pathogens closer to humans. And this is why we see a big spillover of zoonotic diseases and pandemics that we have never seen before. And this is because of the degradation of biodiversity, and more zoonotic diseases, but also more infectious diseases are increasing across all the world. And not only biodiversity loss, but also heat. And we are experiencing it right now, and we are experiencing it more than ever before. And when heat increases, it increases the rate of vectors that are transmitting the diseases. And this is why we can see more outbreaks of infectious diseases. In France, we saw dengue last summer, and more of these diseases are occurring and affecting the most vulnerable populations who are closer to these pathogens and to these vectors. One important thing I wanted to talk about, very directly linked to biodiversity, is mental health. And we know that especially in children and young people, we are hearing more people talking about climate anxiety, which is feeling distress, worried about the existential nature of climate change, of biodiversity loss. A study that was done last year by Google around number of people who are searching climate anxiety, and they compared the first 11 months of 2023 compared to 2017. The search queries around climate anxiety increased 27 times, and that's only overall, but in Portuguese it increased 80 times. And when children in 10 countries, 10,000 young people were asked about, are they worried about climate change? 80% of them said yes, and 45% said that this worry is affecting them from doing their daily activities. I have 2 minutes, and I have to talk about solutions of what we can do to both protect our health and the health of biodiversity, which we depend on. 80% of biodiversity is protected by indigenous communities, and these communities know how to protect it, but what they need is they need to be provided with better food, better healthcare services, and to be included in these discussions that we are having. Nobody talks about communities, and not only should we talk about them, should we empower them to lead their own solutions, should we provide them with better healthcare, better food, for farmers in particular, but also for communities that are protecting the land. They need to be in these rooms where we are having these discussions about biodiversity. We have to engage them, learn from them. They have to work with economists and other policy and political leaders. We have to teach policymakers how to work better with communities, how to work with young people, and we have to do that in a way that is meaningful, that respects their time, the value, and the work that they do. I was the first ever youth envoy to a climate negotiation process, which was the biggest UN climate conference. It was the first time that a space was reoriented to include the voices of people who are most affected. And we need to do more of that reorientation, that radical listening of solutions that work for people before we invest and promote that. Thank you.
Merci. Véritablement, le contexte.
That's the context. That means that we shouldn't put this issue in the back burner, this matter of biodiversity, of degradation. We are going to see what companies can do, the corporate world. This can have an impact on biodiversity. It's also an actor of solutions. Bell, you're the representative of Bell Group. You are an agri-food business company, and you think that it's an important element in the chain in favor of biodiversity? Yes. I'm used to saying that a company is the sum of conversations based on which decisions are made. It's all about being human and having discussions. And often when we talk about diversity, it seems that humans are out of the equation, but biodiversity is not at the service of humans. We think it is, but it's not. We should see ourselves as part of this biodiversity. We're partners. It was very well explained. We need this biodiversity to feed, to get food. I'm part of the agri-food business. I tend to say that when we work in agri-food business, we're not talking about any kind of product. Food is not any kind of commodity. It's a human right. That's fundamental. So when we take it from that angle, then it gives us responsibility. We own have huge liability as a component of the chain. And when we see what's going on right now with the impact on food chain, on biodiversity, but we should talk about a tripod: climate, water, and biodiversity. The good news is that when we work in agri-food business, where instead of having worlds pitted against each other, we can actually merge and bring pathways between worlds. We can work on soil, we can change models and patterns, we can change intensive agriculture that entailed loss of biodiversity, that would exhaust the soils that do not capture carbon, when actually soil's main role is to capture and to sequester carbon. So when we start from the soil, we have an answer that is very consistent, very logical between climate, water, and biodiversity. So we do not pit them against one another. We take the three at once all together. We embrace them together. And when we talk about food chain, we have the capacity to work on the three of them at once. That's interesting what you were saying regarding the economy. You know, the economic point of view, because in a company, that's a sum of conversations. So as a business leader, my only job is to say, okay, which framework am I going to sketch out for this kind of discussion? And the framework in a company would define performance, basically. I create value. I'm not an NGO, I create value. The real matter is, what do we put behind the word value? What do we mean by that? And our deep conviction is that value is not defined by a P&L result. The true profit of the company should integrate all these external components in positive, but also in negative, from the positive and negative point of view. When you were talking about the cost of the Fontainebleau forest, one can say it has a cost, because I'm talking about the costs, and all the costs would actually give out a value it's a pretty straightforward process, and it's debatable. So my opinion is that what interests me is how should we redefine value? Because we're here to win, to look for this performance, to make earnings. We don't talk about financial. We have no CFO with Bell. We're not playing on words. Otherwise, nobody would understand, neither in-house or outside. We have created a position that is the director of global impact, because what he or she steers, is a global impact. So we have one leg that is sustainability, and the other one is financial return. Carbon is easy. We have tons, and we know that we're going to take 150 euros a ton. And in 1 year, we're going to say that it's 175, because this is how we would value carbon. For water, we managed to measure it. We can debate on the value, but we know that dramatically we're going to lack water in the future. Biodiversity, what is complicated for a company is that the value is more difficult to define. We're looking for ways to define it. And KPIs, how can we measure this impact? It's easy to measure carbon. Water, it's easy as well. But biodiversity is another kettle of fish. It doesn't mean that we're not working of it. We're working with WWF and the Agro-Paritech Charter, the accounting one, so as to try to find a value for this biodiversity. And actions are well known, once again, when we're talking about regenerative agriculture. Regenerating agriculture restores biodiversity inside the soils. It gives a role to the worm. The soil has less carbon, they need less entrance, less chemical products to make crop grow, whatever feeds the humans. And it's harder to measure, but it's not because it's difficult that we shouldn't look into it. It's not because we don't have it that we can't start with something. We have started already. And to follow up on what you said on the importance of this food chain and what is at stake at the beginning of the food chain, the reason for which today agro-food business do not transform themselves quickly enough is because we have made the world more poorer to feed the world. We need to make sure that the farmers have a decent salary. Otherwise, they can't transform themselves. Once we do that, we've done it. We've started with France. 18 months after they had changed their practices, they were changing. They had GMO-free food. They're working with their proteinic autonomy. It's difficult. We have to look for profit. We have to look for this impact on return, not only return on investment, but return on impact. That's important, and actions are here. We need to implement them. Actions are concrete. They are also large-scale actions. Sometimes we wonder if we're not talking about micro-solutions. Should we talk about sourcing? Could we talk about outsourcing in Europe? What about the collapse of agricultural return and productivity? We all have these issues to talk about when we want to upscale things. Well, regenerative agriculture is also an agriculture where we know that we can implement it in France and work on productivity. We've done it with 800 farms in France. We are rolling out worldwide. We already have pilot projects in 3 years. We'll have 100% of sourcing with regenerating agriculture in the US. The hurdle today is that we accept to pay more. We go back to the vision, to what you said about the next generation. We are family business. So the only obsession of my shareholders is the next generation. So when we think about our children, our grandchildren, then we accept to invest, because I don't accept that it is a cost. It will be valued in my P&L ultimately, and it gives me a competitive edge because I have a long-term vision. I invest in this because when you are going to give the upper hand to ones that feed you, that you guarantee a decent salary to them, I can tell you they will manage to scale up and to integrate what we need to have a soil that would play its role to the full and that will welcome biodiversity to capture water and to capture carbon. Thank you, Cécile Delio. There's always this matter of timelines, and that the fact that the clock is ticking. You're head of OCP on phosphates, so we're going to take stock of the situation on the use of phosphates, and especially this zoom on the biodiversity issues in Africa, something that is quite remarkable, unlike as we said earlier, that's a degradation that has really been ramping up recently. Thank you, Mrs. Robert. Hello, everyone. I'm starting from the observations of Mr. Fontanier, which are very interesting. First, on figures, I agree with you. On the controversies on. However, as far as Africa is concerned, I tried to cross-reference data and figures from different sources. So there are figures that are not in doubt in any way on this loss of biodiversity. And Mrs. Krockman, I really like what you said about this, about biodiversity. I agree with what you've said, Mr. Fontanier. However, to give you a snapshot of Africa today, well, it's 20% of emerged Earth today. It's 30 million of square kilometers. And unfortunately, I asked the technicians to show a map. It was not possible technically, but Africa, we can put in Africa all of Europe, or West and Central Europe, the US, China, India, and many other territories in this continent. There's only 1 billion inhabitants. That's 1/3 of the world inhabitants. But population growth will be important in the years to come on this continent. Africa is 1/6 of the world forest coverage area. That means 1/6 of the green lung of the planet. Africa is also 60% of cropland that can be used for food safety, for world's food safety purposes. So we can see how much is at stake in this continent. Regarding biodiversity more precisely, this continent, as I said, is the second green lung of the Earth, and the forest of the Congo watershed itself, on its own, covers 8% of the world's biodiversity. So we have 3.6 million of square kilometers scattered in 6 countries: Cameroon, Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Emir. In Africa, it's more than 50,000 species, like plants and mammals, 2,500 bird species, 1,000 amphibians, even reptile species, and 350 humid areas in 8 human humids, are actually 8 of which are hotspots. It's very critical out of the 34 in the world.
Wetlands cover about 130,000 hectares, mainly the different mangroves, etc. And the continent contains some of the biggest rivers in the world. The Nile in Egypt, and everyone knows the history of that country. There is no Egypt without the Nile. The Congo River, the Niger River and the Zambezi River, without talking about those major lakes, which are the sources of many other rivers. So demographic growth, yes, I'll talk about that later on. And the extension of human habitats are provoking the deterioration of natural habitats and spreading out agricultural land to the detriment of the forests. And in the forests is the best place to sequestrate carbon. There's over-exploitation of fish by big factories, sailing factories, big fishing, industrial fishing vessels. And there's a lot of illicit trading. And that all weighs very heavily on biodiversity. And I echo what Mr. Fontanier was saying about the 1 million species that are going to disappear, and many of those disappearances will be in Africa. So this list of the impacts on the cost and the price to be paid, well, where are the exit gates then? Where's the way forward for Africa? Well, I'd like to add two further things. Africa accounts to 40% of mine reserve in the world. We've talked about phosphate, so there's a huge percentage of that. 70% of the world's resources are in Morocco, so it's so important for world security. So phosphates, as we know, are organic. And what we need to do is to guarantee that we have the right dose at the right time in the right soil, and we also have to take care of carbon sequestration. If you think back to the 15th COP in Paris, we were talking about 4 per 1,000 of CO2, and that would prevent the temperature rising by that half temperature that is weighing heavily above us. So let's talk about solutions now. In terms of world food security for all living things, for plants, for example, as you know, Monsieur Fontanier was talking about those medicinal plants. Over half of them are in Africa. They have not yet been fully explored. We're talking about a very, very rich continent whose inhabitants are very poor. So that's rather striking, is it not? I was talking earlier on about mining resources, over 40%, and some ores are at higher levels, diamonds, for example, practically half of all the world resources. And for some precious metals, such as everything we need to make batteries, for wind turbines, all of that is in Africa, mainly in Africa, not only in Africa, but without talking about the rare earths. But the wealth doesn't remain in Africa. It goes elsewhere. We've got these transfer prices. A lot of it is illegal, using different tax measures which are not detrimental to the companies, but they are detrimental to the countries, the populations. We've got this problem of water as well. As you know, there's a lot of water in Africa. However, only 4% of land is irrigated. Africa could feed the world. However, it is importing for $30 billion worth of stuff so that it can feed its own people. Today, I believe that the entire world needs to be concerned about rebalancing this equation in Africa. I think Remy Rio, in a major book written about the African economy in 2004, well, he mentioned $1,500 billion, which would be necessary between now and 2030 to cope with the deterioration of the soil in Africa. At COP Paris, we're talking about 100 billion to adapt to climate change. Okay, So we've thrown some figures out there now. Let's save some time to address other questions which might come from the audience. So we've taken stock of the situation, the importance of water and carbon. Lionel Fontanier, let's try and start drawing some conclusions here, if we could, after this first exchange there, and then afterwards we'll hand the floor to each panel member. Well, my first conclusion is that Mohamed Soual has just illustrated what I've been saying. Economists have been indexing geography. They've given us a great geography lesson. And I believe that what has transpired from our discussion here is that all of the problems that we're up against, problems is a bit of a weak word, they're catastrophes really, they're all linked to climate change, to the problem of water, biodiversity. Climate change is destroying biodiversity, it's creating problems with water, and when because there's less biodiversity, we need more fertilizers, we need to use more phosphate, and we are exhausting the earth. It's an infernal circle. And I would like to give you one figure from the report I was mentioning earlier on. If we continue as we're doing right now, if we do continue like this, to keep our current level of life and so that the economy doesn't crumble, we would need an entire planet which is 1.6 times bigger than the one we have. So we'll have to go off and look elsewhere for that extra half a planet, because should we going to move to Mars? Well, it could be a bit tricky to do that, but we are going to have to include in our economic calculations, in the decisions that are taken in society, in how we organize our institutions, we're going to have to start including again the word finite. We don't like this word, but resources are finite. We're in a finite world. Energies, people have a t-shirt with printed on it, we only have one planet, which is of course the truth. We've got one planet only, and we're taking too much away from it. We're going to have to change the way we act. And if we don't do that, things will be terrible. I would like to applaud microeconomic initiatives which are taken. They're very, very valuable. They're showing the way. But we are really going to have to be more macroeconomic, more global in our approach, and find bodies that can solve these problems. The good news is what you've just said. Youngsters are aware of this. You mentioned that when you were mentioning medical issues, for example. So the youngsters are aware of the situation. We have to allow the youngsters to come in and join the debate. Give them a stronger voice there. I've also heard you talking about indigenous peoples. It's perhaps less pertinent to France, but it is very relevant to the Americas and probably also to Africa, Australia too. And so we can learn from indigenous peoples. From the beginning of time, they have created perfect nature, and we do nothing less than rush in and spoil it all. So we can learn from the indigenous peoples. We really need to think carefully about the path we want progress to take, because progress is not always heading in the right direction. Thank you very much. We are going to use the remaining 15 minutes to invite questions from the floor. Kindly use a microphone if you wish to ask a question. Thank you. If we understand correctly, you are saying that to protect the ground and biodiversity in Africa, you need 1,500 billions. If around a planetary scale, you multiply that by 2 or 3, we're talking about 5,000 billion. Is this right? That's twice as much as we spent on weaponry. So I'm not going to ask how on earth we're going to fund all that. I'm just going to leave that to the men of state. But the questions that I have for the economists here is, what is the share of research and development, for example, in farming? There is very little agronomical research carried out in order to enhance yields, whereas farming accounts for almost half or 40% of global warming. So have we assessed on a European scale or a regional or a world scale, have we assessed what needs to be done, how to do it, to enhance that? So R&D could be used to the advantage of the climate, etc. Another question, so what are we doing at school? You are doing this with businesses, but what are we doing in schools? We teach children how to swim, how to go life-saving in the swimming pool. But what can we do with the school children? How can we help these younger generations? How can we get them used to the situation? If they don't start to have these reflexes at 5 or 6, then it's already too late. So yes, you have to write books, you have to make films. There's such a lot of scope for things to be done. So what a business is doing, I'm sure Veolia, that's what they do. And I am absolutely convinced there are many, many things that companies can do. Well, I think you'd all three like to answer that question. There's many levels to that question. Well, thank you very much for this question, a major question. When we're talking about the 5,000 billion that we've just calculated there, the figure doesn't come from me. It comes from economists who are very, very competent and very respectful. Mr. Fontanier, you know them, I'm sure. And it's all been corroborated by the AFD and the French Development Agency. So today, let's take Apple, the company. Do you know how much it's worth? 3,000 billion. Nvidia, how much do you think that's worth? A little bit more than Apple. We're talking dollars here. Just take a look at all of that money, which is around. I think someone said this morning, Philippe Avion, perhaps, who was saying that today, he and Marco Netta, they were saying that European savings, in the absence of a global market here in Europe, all your money's going to the States and it's invested in American companies. The money does exist. So are we aware that we're all living on the same planet? Listen to this. I'm not going to be commenting events that are taking place tomorrow in France. However, we've got 1 billion of Africans who are going to rock up here in the next few years. So that is going to be half of the youngsters on the planet in a couple of years' time will be in Africa. So if you are expecting a tidal wave of climate refugees, then that's what we're going to see. That's what's going to happen. This is not threat. I'm not threatening anybody, and I'm certainly not adopting the political discourse of any party. However, this is a real challenge. Then in 2013, you can take a look at this. The Economic Commission of Africa, part of the African Union, put some figures on $80 billion. That will be the money that's leaving Africa every year, either illegally or because of transfer prices. So if we had world governance or an international law, you could counter that. So that's an answer to the first part. Yes. Next, you're right, R&D is absolutely fundamental, and not everybody realizes this. However, we are a company which has set up a university. We're now starting to be visible. It's the Mohammed VI, the Polytechnic north of Marrakesh. So we've set up that university, and we're working on this, on carbon sequestration, on fertilizers that can be used in the soil without deterioration, without damaging it, water that can be used, as we heard earlier on, We consume a lot of water. 50%, we've consumed 50% of industrial water in Morocco. All of this water comes from non-conventional sources. These are water treatment stations that are found in the cities where we have our factories, and also we remove the salt from seawater. By 2030, all of our energy will be low carbon, 100%. We've already got 4 giga. I'm sorry to butt in here, but I've got to halt you in your flow there because we've got to include everybody. It was a big question and everyone needs to have an opportunity to answer because, yes, there are many solutions. I'd like to talk a little bit about education and how essential education is in biodiversity and commitment to biodiversity.
The point around education. So in 2021, over 60 ministers of education committed to integrating climate change into school curriculum across the world, that it would be mandatory for all school children. And this inspired me when I was a medical student to look into the education of medical students who are going to be the future doctors that will respond to the impacts of climate change on their patients. So we did that in Egypt, but we did not only do it for medical faculties, but we did across all the faculties in my university. So integrating climate change in the university student education, and we discovered that many countries did the same. This year is going to be the first ever climate camp for teachers to teach them about climate change so that they can teach their students about climate change in their own schools as well as in universities. What we're doing right now, I'm based in the UK in London, and we are working with teachers not only to integrate climate change in schools, because you teach children about climate change, but you need to also help them cope emotionally with the distress of learning about the climate crisis. So we're working with teachers around the world to not only integrate climate change, but also mental health and coping mechanisms for school children to learn about climate change. I personally worked with many children around the world when Egypt was hosting the climate conference, and we had many children delegation. And this year there was the first ever dialogue in the UN to discuss the impacts of climate change on children, and how can education play an important role in building their capacity, their agency, to do their own climate solutions, but also to choose to work in climate careers. So instead of working for a fossil fuel company, they would work in renewable energy sector, work in restoration, work in biodiversity, lead their own nature-based and biodiversity solutions that will both help the health of their generation, but also biodiversity health.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y avait d'autres questions? Je vous en prie.
Bonjour, Marine Bro, j'ai eu l'honneur de...
Hello. I have had the honor of working with many specialists on the national biodiversity strategies, and I would like to come back to the question about the tragedy of horizons. You were saying earlier on that biodiversity requires investments for future generations, and I'm not 100% in agreement with what you said, because biodiversity regenerates quickly enough to be of benefit to current generations. However, I'd like to give you a bit of an anecdote here. I had explained to a financial expert that 50% of international GDP was based on services delivered free by nature, and those services today are being deteriorated and are crumbling. Most businesses today are blind to the services on which they depend and the status of those services, and so the investments of that financial person are at risk, and he wasn't aware of it. And he replied, he said, "Is it going to crumble in 3 years?" He said, "Well, that doesn't bother me then. It's no concern of mine." So how on earth can we get beyond this tragedy of horizons? And to come back to the very first speaker, do you think it's necessary to put a price on nature to actually manage that job? This is amazing. She was reading what was in my mind. This is exactly what I was going to be talking about. So this is a question about microeconomic calculations. So for carbon, we've thought about that in depth. We've seen how we can put a price on carbon. Although today what we do not know how to do is to say whether the price of carbon is the same in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, or if, as in the United States, we should make it different. So that is a big question. So how do you change the calculation for the different businesses? So I'm an economist, and I tend to think that if we put a price on carbon, it will be really easy because it objectivizes this element. And if you've got a price which is equal to the negative impact that it generates, then you've already moved forward greatly in the calculation I referred to earlier. Now, I'd like to come back to what you're saying also, i.e. we don't know how to put a price on biodiversity, and that harks back to my stupid example of the forest there. So how can you effectively measure the services that are rendered by nature? Because that's what we're talking about. There are different methodologies in economics. There's that methodology which I mentioned. There are others to measure how much you can pay the different economic protagonists. There's another one, an organisation in Paris carried out some work to identify how much the European resident would pay not to have antibiotics in their shrimps. So be careful what you order at the restaurant this evening. But if you have a shrimp cocktail or you have paella with shrimps in it, those shrimps have been grown, in inverted commas, in Thailand with lots of antibiotics. They've been fed antibiotics, high doses thereof, because the antibiotics are very at high concentrations in the different ponds. So here we've got a real problem. I would mention honey as another case in hand. It's a similar example. When you buy honey, and you have your tea with a teaspoon of honey in it, if there are any doctors in the room, they know very well that you're not being cured because of the tea or the honey that you're taking in the tea. It's because of the antibiotics that are in the honey. So I'd like to finish on a serious note. There are some serious laws in Europe. They're called the SPS, the health and phytosanitary rules. They are highly criticized in Europe because we tend to say that health, human health and plant health and invasions of different species is all very important. We've got very strict rules and regulations and lots of barriers in Europe. So many cargoes are returned back to the country of origin. I'm not going to say which these countries of origin are, but the cargo is sent back there because they do not respect the rules and regulations. So we do have rules in place, and that is an incentive. If a country sees their cargo boat going back to them with their cargo boat still full, then they will change and perhaps have a more healthy attitude towards beekeeping, for example. But prices do have a role to play, this is for sure. Any economist will tell you that. But the thing is, how do you calculate the price? Does the price have to be the same for countries where their actualization rates are different because some countries want to fuel consumption more quickly than others? And the countries have different responsibilities, historically speaking. And here we go back to the Paris Agreement that you mentioned. There are some countries that have contributed more to the destruction of biodiversity, and they contributed more to carbon emissions. So should those countries pay a higher price for biodiversity than those who have have caused less loss of biodiversity? So we're talking about one economy, but we have to address this by one body, a global body, and that's where it's difficult. We need to get cooperation. We need to tie these different parts together, and we have to wrap up there, otherwise we will be told off. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and being here.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. My name is Calfred Font. I'm delighted to welcome you for this roundtable dedicated to rebuilding the food system. There's many of you here in this room, but also online, and we thank you for this. You'll have the opportunity at the end of this discussion to have a Q&A, so please don't hesitate. And I will now welcome all the speakers. We have Jennifer Barn, you're the Director of Partnerships of the Alliance for the Green Coalition in Africa. We also have Carlos Enrique Cavalier. You are the coordinator of REV, or Dreams, and you're the president of the Colombian company Alqueria. We also have Nathalie Begin. You are an economist. You are the member of the National Council of Food Security in Brazil. You will also have Romain Blanchard, who is the Deputy Secretary General of ANSEMA. And we also have Thierry Blandinière. You're the General Director of the In Vivo Agricultural Cooperative Company. And I'll give the floor to my friend Akiko Suwa Aisanam, who's economist in the Cercle des Économistes and who's also an expert in the United Nations, to introduce this topic. Thank you. Hello, everyone. For 20 years, food safety has been undermined by climate crisis, as Mr. Lucas reminded us this morning during the opening. Financial crisis of 2008, natural disasters, epidemics, and the numerous conflicts in a lot of countries. More than 280 million people in 59 countries are in a state of acute food insecurity, according to the IPC foods classification. More than one household in 5 doesn't manage to eat properly or needs to sell assets to eat, with long-term consequences. These multiple shocks strike the food system at different levels: agriculture, agri-food processing systems. We know that the first victims of COVID in the US were the workers in the slaughterhouses, but also trade. They also strike one country one after the other. Households, governments do not have any budgetary margin to answer to the shocks. Households have exhausted all their remedies. They don't feel supported. They lose trust in the government. To respond to these shocks, we need to reinforce the food system as a whole. The food system is 3 components: the value chain from farm to the fork. We should also include waste collection, all the conditions in which we take our decisions, such as education, nutrition, publicity, and also the consumer's decisions. These 3 components together will determine what we eat and its impact on health, society, and planet. And all this is taking place in a background of exhaustion of resources, water, pollution, and soil exhaustion. So to go back to the food system, we have to set aside the fake solutions, the false solutions, namely to act only one element on farmers, for instance, or consumers, or ask everything from the consumers. Another wrong solution is to find a scapegoat, to say that, to shame and blame Europe. It's a bad solution because the food trade loss is with the Europeans and not with the rest of the world. We should ban exports. That would actually expose us to problems with our partners. We're a big exporting country. What about shaming and blaming immigration? What about labor? We need external labor for farming, for factories, for trade, for hospitality, and what about naming and shaming the green impact? What about then we wouldn't fight against pollution? The good solution, the right solution, consists in adapting a global approach to reinforce the food system as a whole, to work on all the links, the components of food system. That requires coordination among the different stakeholders, which is quite difficult because they have divergent and dissenting needs and opinions. There's a lot of inequalities. Large distribution is dominated by a very few stakeholders that share a large portion of the market. 1/3 of the salaried employees, and they generate 42% of the turnover. Farms, actually, the farms landscape is where there are most inequalities. We need to rebuild the food system, but for this, we need to take into account all the different sizes, the balance and imbalances of power. We need to make them work together to ensure food security today and tomorrow, and to respond and face and address food security issues and social inequality issues. Thank you. Thank you, Akiko. We see the dilemma of the countries. We need to preserve food safety. We need not to impact on the consumers. We need to make sure that they can feed themselves. But we need to preserve also the income of farmers. Sometimes it's difficult to have both issues tackled at once. So what do you think? Should we ensure first food security or safety or security? What do you think? What an introduction. It's difficult to take over and to take the floor after that because everything has been said and we can see how the world can be complex today. The vision of globalization, how it has evolved. Farming has turned worldwide very easily. We've had the GATT very soon. We talked about vegetable protein, saying that it's in Brazil and the US, and we would have the cereals. We'll still work with this world segmentation nowadays. And we can see the anxiety that it triggers this way of the world. And that refers back to problems of sovereignty. We were talking about happy globalization earlier on, but we're not there yet. Globalization, however, is still in existence. So we can't go back to local markets, to European markets or French market. We need to adjust our globalization policy in such a way where we could have geopolitical dimensions for cereals, for instance. We've seen it with Russia, for instance, in Ukraine. We can see the impact on inflation. Wheat has become a weapon for some countries to generate inflation and destabilize our economies. And facing this, what could we do in France, in Europe? That's a European response that we have to forge, not only French. So quickly, we have to coordinate ourselves with a European policy, public policy, so that it would take into account this new game change. The Green Deal that was done just before this crisis did not integrate this dimension of sovereignty and evolution of world geopolitics on cereals and world food flows. So we are looking at only one angle. How do we find solutions facing these food-related issues and environmental issues in France? And in Europe, we thought, let's decrease our production, but we should have a better quality. And that's behind us now. Our logic is to say, why don't we put sovereignty in the center? How can we produce more with less, better, at a competitive price? Because this is also important for exportation purposes. We can't play on the French market with French consumers. We have to work with the African continent because it's very important with the immigration. So we have a mission. We need to export our cereals to these countries because with climate change, we will never be able to relocate production in these countries. So ultimately, we have to design, reshape a new world, recreate bonds. We have to imagine and design a new world with new balances of powers. And we have to have a European reasoning. That means that the New Deal has to evolve. We need to put forward solutions and funding for innovation. With new technologies, we need to rethink farming. Something that is accurate, that would be able to scale up and to respond to all the needs and increase the income of farmers. It's not only a matter of price, but it's a price multiplied by the volume. This is how it ends up. So we need to find the right equation between competitiveness, price, volume. We need to increase the potential of production of the stakeholders in France and Europe. How could we do it? Well, we have to work on innovation heavily, because if we say, okay, tomorrow we have to work on a decarbonated stream, which is what is at stake in farming nowadays. I'm developing that subject. It is essential. We need to know how we can find solutions for each link of the manufacturing and processing stream to guarantee to consumers that the bread that they will eat, the baguette, will be decarbonated. And each time they will buy a baguette, they will work for the climate, in favor of climate, because the company will have committed towards that. How can we change that? How can we transform the wheat stream, the wheat business line? It's interesting to see how we can go from the farmers, then the mills, the bakeries, and so on. This can be done thanks to new energy we can decarbonate easily with a change in logistics. But it's more difficult at the farmers' level because there's a lot at stake in terms of seeds and fertilizers. We import carbon. And for baguette, actually, fertilizers account for 5% of the price. So if we would have winter fertilizers, 5% of our carbon footprint would be would be deducted. So it goes beyond. What is at stake is beyond the farming business industry. We have to look at the whole industry. How about having green fertilizers manufacturers in France? We should buy those green fertilizers. Of course, we should set it off and have other offsetting mechanisms, but we can change the food chain and show and demonstrate that when we scale up, it is possible. So many factoring companies are working towards that direction. We need to scale up, and for this, we need massive transformation. We have to see how how pesticides evolved. How can we find alternative solutions to pesticides? Can we have biostimulants? How can we work on control? How can we work on the quality of soils? How can we get into this momentum? And this has a price, and we need to do all this at a competitive price, because if it is 50% more costly, then nobody will buy it. So we need to make it to deliver on our promises. There's a lot of solutions that are not well known, and they are on the table. They are in existence. I'm very optimistic. How can we fund this transition? How can we tag this public expenditure to fund this transformation? And then the market will be here and will deliver, because we'll be competitive and will not be more costly than others. I don't want to speak too much at length, but there are solutions. We're working on it. Suppliers work on it. There is competition. But in the US, in Brazil, we know that there's a lot of conscience. They are aware of how much important it is. In the 5-10 years to come, there will be a lot to fight against climate change, and we will show that farming is part and parcel of the solution. Thank you. You gave me the right transition for the next speaker, because we can see that the question is how, as a farmer, can we move forward on this question of income without necessarily undermine environmental transition. We needed to put on hold a lot of mechanisms in France. How can we manage to address everything at once? You are at the head of a vineyard and cereal farm, aren't you? Yes. You've said a lot of things. Today, we ask so much from farming, apart from the ancestral role, which was to feed people. Everything that we do has a cost. It requires know-how. So we look for sources of income, obviously. There are several things. What is the consumer willing to pay for this? I'm only talking about France, then you can actually scale up to the world. We think that it's a right to because we haven't been hungry for some time now, so we are not ready to pay a high cost for our food. But then how can we fund it? We need to work for biodiversity. We need to make sure that labor is well paid. Everything costs money for the farmer. That's a starting point. But there's also a second thing, and I go back to what you said, Mrs. Soa. We are in a food system, because this is what you're talking about, where there are some operators that actually account for a significant part of the whole volume. So how about the breakdown and the allocation of value on the whole production system, from the production to the distributor? And there's something that could be actually a synthesis of everything. We are in Aix-en-Provence. That's the first département for fisheries. We are in full fisheries swing season. And in Château Renard, we have tier A fisheries.
Sur ces mines, directement au
And the same peaches, sorry, it's not fisheries, but peaches. Yesterday, they were sold at 5.09 euros. So we can see that everything is inaccurate here. So this is quite interesting, this issue, because we have to get an interest in the way we produce and what it means in preservation of nature, ecosystems, sharing with our co-workers, doing some research, but also what about the value that we generate with our food? Because I told you that the allocation of cost is decreasing in the household, but who's taking that money? Because there's something that is really important in a chain. A chain has the resistance of the weakest link in the chain. And so if that is the weakest link, at one point it will break, and all the progress that we try to implement will not be there anymore. We won't move forward, we'll go backwards. And if we stop here and it's not profitable anymore, because this is business, everything that we put together with it will stop at once. Thank you. You're saying that it can be put on hold because of the political context, and this is why nothing is done for the farmers. Stop. Let's talk about Brazil.
Avec vous, Nathalie Béguin, vous me disiez le système n'est plus tenable.
You said that the system is not viable anymore. We have to get out of it. We are having a system that is a killer. What have you set up in Brazil to fight against this? Hello, everyone. I'm talking to Europe first and then Brazil, because we're undergoing a tragedy that's one of the greatest food producers, but 30 million people are hungry. That means they don't eat every day according to national official statistics. And this shouldn't be allowed. But what have we done in Brazil? At the beginning of the 90s, 20% of the population was in a situation of serious lack of food safety, and now it's 5% of the population living in such conditions, which is considered as acceptable. Well, this is what you said, Delico. We have set up a social technology of public policy that has three ingredients. First, a National Council for Food Security and Nutrition, which is an advisory council with the President of the Republic, having 72 members, 24 ministers, 48 representatives of the civil society, and this is where I sit there as a representative of an NGO. And this council is in charge of the setting up of a plan for food safety, and there's also an interministerial chamber of ministers in charge of implementing that plan. This is what you said. We have the coordination. We have also the interministerial coordination to make sure that we anticipate the 3 points that you mentioned: production to fork, consumption, and food security. So the idea to face and address food safety, in our case hunger, is that everyone should work hand in hand together. And thanks to that, we managed to set up public policies to have access to food, with the transfer of income, Bolsa Familia, for instance. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's an enormous transfer program of income. 80 million people are affected. We have also farming production assistance policies, because it's for soya, corn. There's nothing done about beans. This is what we eat every day. And so there's a large program of subsidies for family farming. What we have set up as well, we have a huge school food program for giving food to 40 million children. We also have a regulation system because there's a huge problem of diet. The Brazilian diet is all about maize and beans, but now life is more and more difficult. So ultra-processed food take over, and because it's easier to cook, it's less costly, they take more and more space and more, they take over, they take more place than corn and beans, and this is why more and more people in Brazil are obese. We have the highest obesity rate and that doesn't solve the problem of hunger. We've had an extreme right government for 4 years. They've dismantled everything, and now we have 33 million that are affected. It takes a long time to set it up, to destroy. So we have to pay a lot of attention who we vote for, because everything could be destroyed overnight. And this is what we've lived and what we've gone through in Brazil. Thank you. Carlos Cavalier, you're the president and coordinator of Revdacaria. That's one of the greatest milk producers in Colombia. Could you say what's a coordinator? Because we're quite intrigued by a dream coordinator. What's a dream coordinator? I'm an anthropologist, so it's hard to be CEO, shareholder of a company. That's a lot of hierarchy. So being a dream coordinator helps me to be at the same level, to work more and see eye to eye with people at the same level. And nobody should be afraid to talk to me. This is why we have decided not to have any hierarchy and that we have no line managers. I'm going to talk about the Colombian economy and agriculture. Unfortunately, I can speak in English. Well, of course you can speak in English if you want.
In Colombian agriculture, a critical step for attaining peace. Colombia is a country with a territory almost twice the size of France, which it has never been able or wanted to control, as Daniel Picot has crudely emphasized to us. This is one of the indirect sources of violence in Colombia. While 51 million Colombians live in 1/3 of the country, on mountain ranges and the valleys between them, in the west and center of the country, 12 million of them, 23%, live in the countryside within the agricultural frontier. They're grouped in some 2.2 million households, agriculture units that cultivate top 10 crops, fruits and vegetables, meat, corn, rice, potatoes, cassava, palm, cocoa, and banana. Their agriculture GDP does not exceed 8% of the national GDP, indirectly generating a gross income per person much less than half of the income of the rest of the Colombian population, mostly urban. The absence of state presence indirectly promotes violence, but the lack of real and outstanding economic opportunities for farmers is a critical factor as well. Peasants in general live in subsistence and poverty with less than 2/3 of the minimum wage. Guaranteeing transformation of their farms to be able to exceed the 1.43 minimum wage that would take them out of monetary poverty must be a national priority. Even in the process of disarmament of armed groups and the abandonment of illegal crops like coca, for traditional, legal, and profitable crops, it's an element without which this objective would not be achieved. Let's take 3 crops that would make a big difference in reducing poverty in Colombia: coffee, cocoa, and milk, lifting a total of 3.3 million people out of poverty and vulnerability, with total produce of 5.6 billion euros of total income. In the case of cocoa, for example, which I would take as an example, last year it produced 60,000 tons in 160,000 hectares, 50,000 families who exported grain and value added of about 150 million euros, leaving them less than a minimum subsistence wage. If Colombia were to plant 1 million additional hectares of cocoa, the income of the more of 250,000 families that would do so would grow to about 2 billion euros, counting slightly higher prices and big improvements in productivity. That is leaving more than 500 euros per household's net income per month, lifting over 1 million people out of poverty. Of course, undoubtedly, agricultural reform, agrarian reform is needed to reach those 1 million hectares of coca planted. To get a glimpse of agricultural potential in the Orinoco in the east, which is mostly inhabited, White Plains inhabited, with 14 million hectares of an agricultural frontier, it only planted 6% of it, 1 million hectares. In another exercise of prospection, this 13 million hectares planted could produce 36 million tons of agricultural and livestock products for an additional gross GDP of 34 billion euros. That is an 8% more than national GDP and 1.5 times more than the agricultural GDP, the current agricultural GDP. With the 5.6 billion mentioned above, the agricultural GDP would exceed 17%. If we're able to take the same exercise for tobacco, potatoes, cassava, and other tubers like rice, fruits, avocado, artisanal corn, and vegetables, we would surely have a picture, a resource, budget, and horizons to eliminate rural poverty in Colombia. Thus, Colombia would surpass the 20% of the agricultural GDP that Brazil has in its national accounts. Thus, the gross income of peasants would start to reach a similar income level to the rest of their urban compatriots. Peace would be, at least on the horizon, at least at the economic levels of these 15 million Colombian peasants.
Merci pour votre témoignage également. Je vous propose qu'on aille en Afrique avec vous, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Let's move across to Africa with Jennifer Barnes. It's good to have you with us. You are head of Africa Green Revolution Forum. So how do you see this transformation of the food system in Africa, and how on earth is it being funded?
So it's always a challenge to speak on behalf of an entire continent. Africa is extremely diverse, but when it comes to our challenges in transforming our food systems, I do think you see a lot of commonalities. More than half of Africa's population lives in rural areas, and of those who live in rural areas, over 80%, I'm even inclined to say 100, is dependent for their income on agriculture value chains. Nevertheless, those that grow the food for Africa are often also the places where you find the highest rates of malnutrition. It's a bitter irony. And I fully agree with some of the urgency that you put forward that something needs to change. Because our rural economies are also the most under-resourced. So our farmers are also the most under-resourced. Just to give an example, on average, we see perhaps 1 tractor or 10 tractors per square kilometers in even the best of circumstances, compared to in India, where the amount of tractors is 123 per square kilometer. I'm not saying that tractors will solve all the world's problems, but it gives an indication in terms of the gap of access to technology, inputs, and all the different things that a farmer actually requires. So my stand in life is actually quite simple. Solve the problems of the African farmer, and we have solved global food systems problems. I'm an Afri-optimist, so I don't want my message to be negative and only about what is not there, because there's also a significant potential on the continent. The Africa Development Bank has calculated that Africa has the potential to generate a food and agribusiness sector of over $1 trillion, partly driven by, of course, the demographic growth, urbanization, and a buoyant middle class. There are more than 36 biodiversity ecosystems across Africa. So also when it comes to matters such as climate action, this continent can actually play a decisive role in addressing some of these challenges. So I'm an Afri-optimist. Africa has the potential to be a breadbasket, not just for the continent, but also beyond. I work for an organization that was established by Kofi Annan purely out of frustration that the green revolution that brought improved seeds to farmers all over the world, including Brazil and Colombia, and the rest of Asia seemed to have surpassed Africa. But we have learned lessons in the almost 2 decades that we've been on the continent, initially focusing on seed systems. And therefore, these are some of my solutions. We need to adopt a food systems approach that is not siloed. And I really applaud the RAS COP28 that was the most of the food systems oriented COPs ever, because the complexity that our farmers are facing, and I hear you when you say you're running a vineyard, that all of the problems actually come on your table all at once, not in a sequence or siloed ways as often we in the development space would like to see it. So adapt the food systems approach and the complexity that comes with it. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is critical to us. Structuring, strengthening internal trade flows on the continent are critical for farmers with surplus to have access to markets and increase their income. But there's a lot more that need to happen, of course. A lot of the key decisions that are being made also by our policymakers on the continent lack actually data and analytics that allow us to make evidence-based decisions. So those are some of the factors that we also need to invest in. But I want to go back to the farmer and about how we manage and drive our value chains. We need integrated value chain solutions that help us across the value chain to reduce fragmentations and mitigate risk. And this could be schemes and programs such as inclusive finance and looking at blended finance instruments. It is also related to how we aggregate and coordinate farmers and link them to offtake markets processors. It's across the value chain, and it's not happening sufficiently enough. I would also like to highlight very briefly a few things. Bridging the last mile to the farmer. It's still easier to get a bottle of Coca-Cola at an affordable price into any rural area than it is for critical items such as improved seeds, fertilizer, and pest control. We need to, it's not only the technology that we develop, it's the business model that helps us to deliver that technology to farmers in an affordable, available way, and also in such a way that they are aware, trained, and knowledgeable on how to apply that. I'm mentioning these methods because the way we approach this is very critical in terms of what can be transformative or not. It's the way how we actually also deliver implementation that will be critical. Lastly, robust government systems and building the state capability to deliver. So many decades after the Malabo Declaration, so many African governments are still not investing 10% of their funding into agriculture. And then lastly, how do we measure progress and how do we hold everybody accountable? That's only the beginning. I'm happy to talk about how we're going to finance all of this going forward. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. On parle de rebâtir le système.
So we're talking about reconstructing the food system, and often the global scale seems to be the most appropriate. But in many countries there is a temptation, particularly here in France with political landscape, to talk about protectionism. So how far should we go in these free trade agreements? Perhaps Romain Blanchard, you'd like to tell me about this. What should the stance be here in France? Well, it's difficult for me to answer this question because, as you know, we talked about this because I produce cereal on the one hand, but I also produce wine on the other. So the spontaneous reaction would be to say that France is a big agricultural company, we could be self-sufficient, let's shut down our borders, and like that the prices would correspond to production costs. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. However, as you've said, we export a lot, and I'm a wine grower. And if we're talking about figures, here in eggs, 70% of my volume gives over 60% of my export margin. If we shut down the margin, shut down the borders, I'm going to go bankrupt. So that's what we need to include in everything that my neighbours have said. It's a very complex system, agriculture. Locally, we've talked about biodiversity, etc., but all of these discussions are part of an overall balance. I grew up in an open world, and I want the world to remain open. We've talked about transmission and passing things on. I'd like to pass things down to my children. Today, farming has to be open, remain open. So the question of international agreements is not a credible alternative. Well, thank you very much for that. So, Nathalie Béguin, in France, we're talking a lot about agreements between Mercosur and Europe. So I'd like to hear you and Mr. Blondinier talk about that. Well, I do not agree with what you've said. I belong to a network of organizations in South America, Mercosur, and we have partnerships with the different European bodies. The principle is okay. However, we're against the Mercosur-Europe agreement because the current state of these things is very bad for the Brazilian economy. Because modern agriculture in Brazil is fine. It feeds lots of animals all around the world, our corn, our soya, but it's destroying our landscapes, the rainforest. Earlier on, we were talking about Mato Grosso, which you had visited. This is a state which is at the heart of the Brazilian savannah, but now it's kilometre after kilometre of nothing. Okay, there may be hemp and corn, but there are no trees. There are no Indian reserves. We've got indigenous peoples there, Aborigines who have been scattered. And we do not want that. We really don't want that. So I think we do need to cooperate, but we need to cooperate in a different manner so that we can feed people healthily, respecting organic agriculture, animals, etc., just like you're trying to do here in France. We too want to be protected. We want to be able to get back to our traditions, have healthy food, and not have highly processed food, ultra-processed food. We don't want that. That's why we're against this agreement. So Thierry Blondinier, would you like to say something? Well, we're against it, but for other reasons. But however, you know, we're on the same line. Because Brazilian agriculture has to take on board environmental, social issues, has to look at its carbon footprint, look at the quality of its soil, look at environmental charters and social charters as well, and look at Europe's equivalents. And we would be delighted to import Brazilian soya if it corresponds to the European norms, standards, but it's not the case. It's very, very tricky. We cannot reduce our production levels here in France because we would, if we reduce environmental pressure, we lose in yield, and that would mean that we have to import more from Brazil. And Brazil is not making any effort whatsoever to address these particular questions. And so these contradictions that we've been mentioning, a lot of farmers went demonstrating in the street, not only in France but throughout Europe last winter. And it was so that the political decision makers, the governments who are completely out of touch, wanted to get them to understand that we cannot broach a subject or solve a project with a solution which we might just throw in there without taking into consideration the impacts of the decisions. And these mirror clauses are an option. But we didn't accept those mirror clauses. I don't know whether the Parliament are still talking about it. However, it would have been a solution because we'd say, OK, we accept as long as both parties commit to the same vision of the world and farming. So it's a power struggle, a political power struggle. I'm happy to hear that in Brazil, not everybody is on board with the Brazilian government's line, but it is a question of exports. It's like your oil. It's oil for you, if you like. So we have to think about the small-scale farmers as well. It's very, very complicated. There's not a single solution for everything. But everybody has to agree what kind of farming we want in the future. Do we want small-scale farming? It will always exist. It's in France. We need to protect it. These short local circuits, why not? Organic, why not? But for the larger scale farming, we have to take stock of the environmental challenges. We're all fighting the same battle. I went to Brasilia 3 years ago. I met the Minister for Agriculture there in Brazil to talk specifically about this. And it's a bit tricky because when you're talking about the quality of the soil, the quality of soil in Mato Grosso, it's very rich soil. However, French soil is not as rich because they burnt their forests. And if you qualify the quality of soil, Brazil and Mato Grosso is, winning hands up because they're doing better than the French farmers who will try to enhance the quality of their soil. It's very, very tricky. So we have to lay this all out clearly on the table. It's not going to be an easy job, but we have to think about international standards, speak with the same words if we want to have agreements with the Mercosur. I think that's what it's all about. That's my recommendation, at least. So, Jennifer Barnes, how can the African continent weigh in these international exchanges?
Quite interesting. So, I'm not an international trade expert, but I do have a contribution to make, right? So, a few things. International commodity markets impact African farmers in more ways than one, even smallholders in remote villages. The Ukraine crisis has caused a fertilizer crisis on the continent, but it also spurred the interest to create a domestic fertilizer market because we don't want our value chains to lack the resilience and basically be in turmoil every time something happens in the rest of the world. That's number one. Number two, access to international markets, being it Europe, being it Asia, or other parts of the world, is critical for African farmers. But it's for the high value end, and it's often a job creation opportunity for young people coming off university, not being employed. They go into mushroom farming, paprika, sweet peppers, etc., for export markets. And yes, we have to look into quality standards. How can we scale that? How can we replicate that? For the majority of African farmers, unlocking regional markets will be the key to growth and welfare. So if in the coming 5-10 years, if another representative, hopefully I'm already retired from Agra, sits here and still complains that we haven't managed to harmonize and implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we are in deep trouble. And unlocking that comes with other challenges as well, right? It comes with access to available finance for our SME agripreneurs and farmers. It comes with affordable packaging machinery, quality standards, etc. So from my perspective, we're having this conversation on different levels in terms of how it impacts us on the continent. I hope that helps. Lastly, it's difficult also as a continent to always speak with one voice. The challenges are often common, cross-cutting, but in terms of how we engage with the rest of the world, forming one voice, one approach, there's also some opportunism often. It's not helpful. And it's also a critical invitation to the rest of the world to understand that these internal dynamics are linked to global commodity markets, and how you also approach the continent is critical for opportunities across. Lastly, really, Our experience with some of the global commodity value chain, including some of the cash crops, cocoa, coffee, etc., we do not want to replicate that going forward. Let's draw the learnings and the lessons there and try to create a different global commodity system going forward. Thank you.
Carlos Cavalier,
Carlos, what is the right scale for you? Do you think on a global scale? Are you thinking about a national scale? What kind of scale are you thinking about? We have a partnership with the United States and with Europe. We've got free trade agreements, and it's all we're starting to increase our imports. In 2026-27, imports will be completely open. However, we're not really ready for that yet. We have wasted 15 years of hard work with the small-scale farmers to help them to evolve, because we've got 300,000 dairy farmers who could produce 3 or 4 times more milk than is being produced currently, but they produce 10 litres per farmer. That's nothing. It's 5 little bottles of milk. And if they could ramp it up to 100 litres, then we could start to export in the medium term. An equivalent with New Zealand, for example, which really has problems, like everybody, with global warming and methane problems from the cows. We're very clean, and we will have solved, at least I hope so, the problem of methane within the next 6 or 7 years with food supplements for our cows, and that will help us very, very much. Thank you very much for this rich conversation. We've got a few minutes left. Perhaps we'll open the floor up for questions. Please wait for the microphone if you have a question so that we can hear you properly. Hello, thank you very much. I've got a question either for Mr. Blanchard or for Mr. Blandinier. It's a question about France. This is about animal production. I have a fear, and I want to know if you share this fear, and if you do share it, what do you think we can do to solve the problem? And the problem is this. My fear is that in 15 years we will be in France having animal production like we've been in the nuclear field about 18 months ago, i.e. we realise that everything's broken down, that we've lost all of our expertise, that we've lost of our competitivity. If you compare with our neighbours, etc., we're not as competitive as they are, and we are about to reach the point of no return. Do you share that fear? And if you do share that fear, what can we do about it? Hello. Well, I'm not going to be very positive, sadly, because I do share your fear. When we see agricultural demographics and we see breeding farms particularly, your fear is quite justified. We see that there is a trend in society to really blame breeding on everything. We talked about methane, and there's a kind of multifaceted attack on agriculture, not to mention the quality of life of these breeding farms. If you're in the dairy farm, you've got to be 6 a.m. in the morning with your cows. You've got to be there also at 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. every day. It becomes very, very easy. And it's even harder when it's not generating any revenue, which is the case today. And so these industrial sectors are quite structured because we process those raw materials. We don't sell raw milk, of course. And when you take a look at what we've got in the industry, we will be less competitive. And we can look back over the past 30 years, we've destroyed our dairy industry, and it would take so much money to be invested to get back up to scratch again. Well, you've said absolutely everything there is to say there. There is a bit of a challenge, and it's difficult to manage this. If we wish to be competitive, we need to revamp the industry business model, which is a question of size and the different farms. You need to finance more robotics, less hard work on the human beings, and less arduous working conditions. And so you need to have farms that are of a size that it's difficult to implement here in France today. I'm not talking about the farm with 1,000 cows, but sadly, public opinion is not ready to accept this change in business model. However, it would be the solution if we want to be sovereign and if we want to protect the environment, because very, very often, and Eastern Germany, which is now part of Germany in general, they demonstrated that they were able to have a circular economy and to be very competitive for milk, chicken and pork today. And so their trade balance has really switched since East Germany has been included into Germany, because now Germany's taken advantage of that region. They reinvented the model in accordance with the German ecologists to demonstrate that a big farm was even good for the planet. And it was also competitive. And so that's how they have been the biggest producers in Europe. And that is why today there's less chicken and pork and all that in Brittany today, because it's all imported from Germany. I'm not talking about Asia, I'm talking about Germany. So Poland and the Ukraine in the future, you can see what the challenges are. Yes, one can worry about the French industry today because of that type of program, because we will no longer be competitive and we will be lagging further and further behind. So the solutions are in the countryside. We need to take stock of that. We need to find partners in Europe, or we have to redesign our business model, and that will require a lot of political will. So shall we take a last question before we allow Akiko to wrap up there? No, we've not got enough time for a final question, so I'll hand over to Akiko for the conclusion. I would like to thank you all very much for the quality of your input and the diversity of the points of view that have been expressed. You haven't hesitated to get into the nitty-gritty, but to add nuance. And that, I think, is something which we are falling short of today. It's so important. So I also think that we've got some subjects which came back a lot: international integration, climate, reality, being at the right scale, geopolitics, Europe, and fairly sharing things, the potential of African countries, and breeders and farmers in Colombia, innovation, dreams, and the vulnerability that we all stand at the risk of with political reversals. Thank you very much for listening.
Bonjour à tous, ravi de vous retrouver.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be with you. This roundtable is going to be very interesting. The topic's very interesting. Companies with a mission or resigning companies. Now, to introduce this debate, I'd like to give you the backdrop. 25% of new recruits drop their job after 45 days. John Burson study. Last year in France, we had 2.7% of people who resigned in French companies. That means, as an average, 500,000 people who leave every quarter. It was a record last year. Now, things are better since the end of last year, since the beginning of 2024. Now, people want to leave if they're younger, and also in purchasing, logistics, legal, finance, where probably there are more opportunities. So how companies remain attractive? How can we reduce people turnover in industries where jobs might be hard? Apart from the compensation package, are there tools that people can use to attract talents? Now, CEOs and top managers have decided, in some cases, to become a company with a mission, because this gives a type of heading to the people who work for the company. That's what ensued the Loi Pacte, the new French law. So companies have ESG objectives that they set to themselves. These are stringent goals, but they're ambitious. So far, 1,490 companies are entreprises à mission in 2023. That's 1/3 more than the previous year. And this only represents 0.2% of all corporates and 2% of large companies like Enedis or Clarion as well. And we're very happy because with us, we have the CEO with us, Sophie Boissard. Hello, thank you for being here. We will be talking about this. She will be talking about this with Jean-Philippe Puy, the CEO of Avril. Now, Sophie, I'll start with you. So, Clarion's changed its name. Clarion Exterior has become a company with a mission a year ago, I think. Now, what's the change for the workers? And has this had any impact on the turnover rate in the group? Can we say there's the before and the after? That's true. We changed our bylaws a year ago, more or less. Now, in our bylaws or articles of association, we are a company that cares for people when people are in a fragile position. This is the starting point for us. That is, we support the elderly who rely on others. It's care that we provide to people, and also specialized care for people with chronic diseases. Which means that have things changed after a year? Well, it's too early to say. But what we can say is that it was a long type of brainstorming exercise within the company. We have 60,000 people, mainly women, who work for us. And the starting point was, how can we reconcile people's need for care? That's what people want. People come to us because we're in the health sector, and this is what the people who work for us want. They want to care for others. When you ask young people in France, they say, I want to help people in the health sector. That's very important. So we wanted to reconcile, and at Parcoursup we saw that this industry was very much preferred by the youth. That's true. We have 1,000 centers throughout Europe to give people care at home. So how can we reconcile this throughout our organization? That is, if we look at the types of business lines we have in the company, because Clarion stands out. We're different. We have different business lines. How can we reconcile this with our values and our business culture? We have worked on these ideas. So we've defined our roadmap, and this is our raison d'être, our mission, with commitments like fairness. We contribute to innovation. We are a local player as well. And could we have also other initiatives, is what we thought. Yes, so that everybody could remember what it means And for instance, what does it mean to care for people and fairness? We are a company that helps people develop. We take commitments, at least 7,000 youngsters that we help so that they get a diploma at the end of their development. So that's what we do. So I'd say we're in the starting blocks. 98% of the shareholders last year voted so that we could include this mission, the new Articles of Association. We have a committee for our mission. This is our governing body, which is very important. And they discuss with the board of directors. This is very interesting and rich for us. And I think that in 5 years, probably, when the first cycle is over, we'll see. We'll see if this is fruitful or not. Okay. But do you know why people resign when they resign from your company? What's the first reason that they usually mention? Well, let me come back first to the numbers you've given. First, seniority in a company like ours. Usually the average is 42 years of age for our people. And this year, seniority is 7.5 years, so people stay with us for a long period of time. When people resign, they always, or almost always, resign, and we always ask them why. They resign for reasons such as they don't get on well with their managers, or they're not supported by their managers. It's the first reason for us. Usually, since this is a people's business, this is the main reason. So the company culture, the training of managers is something very important, as well as ethics. Operational ethics is very important. To have a mission is not to have a soul or to have a code of conduct, but this is part and parcel of our business. I'm not boasting about it, but I'm saying that this is vital for us. Thank you, Jean-Philippe Puig. You're the CEO of Avril. By the way, Avril is a group that produces, or that owns, Le Sieur and Puget. You're not a company with a mission, but you have your raison d'être, to use the French expression, and I suppose that you use also lots of tools available and initiatives to keep your people, like a parent leave and other tools. Could you talk us through this? Because that's a tool that we can use so that we lower the turnover of people. Well, of course, it's not just Le Sieur and Puget. We're the 5th agro-food company in France. We are in the food business, but also we decarbonate. We're in the food business, that is with oil, but also rice and also animal feed. And also there's decarbonized energy and green chemicals. We're the leader in Europe. We operate in 18 countries. I won't be long, but that's important to talk about this because, as we were saying, when we thought about this, when we wondered about the employees and the reasons why they stayed in the company, because this is our debate, our conversation, or why people want to leave, we were surprised that 6 years ago, 7 years ago, they said, we're very happy to work for you, for Avril, but we don't know what the reasons are. We don't know why. And we're quite happy with our managers, but we don't know what they want from us. That was strange. Thus, we worked with them for something like 3 years, and we thought, okay, we need to have an ambition, a goal, and that's our raison d'être, our goal, that is to serve the earth, servir la terre. That's like the North Pole. You're moving in that direction, even though you might never reach that point. But it's a deep cultural change. That's what we wanted. So our group has a DNA with 2 arms. Safety and security for people, the people who work for us, that's essential. Without safety, you can't do this. And the second branch is our raison d'être, our goal, and we have reasons to act. Now then, we've been doing this for something like 10 years, and we try and listen to the community, that is the different stakeholders. We don't want to say that we have a mission, other companies say, but at least we have people talking about this in the company. People from all walks of life with different views, but that's very important for me because then I can listen to people and what they have to say about us. And then we have an executive committee for the youth. They're very useful, And I asked them the question, I said, what should I do so that you would stay and work for us for 40 years, apart from the salary thing? And what did they answer? They answered, well, you know what you were saying before, a number of commitments. There's one that very much matters. And I said, oh, I don't know if we were to poll people in this room. And now, what's the first idea that came to their mind? The youth. We had 16 people, international profiles, all types of jobs. I'll cut the long story short. They said, we want to work 4 days a week. 4 days. Paid 4 or paid 5? No, paid 5 days, of course. That's what they wanted. It's interesting. So they had looked around at other companies. And did you say, of course we can? No. I've grey hair already. And I said, no. So we talked about other things as well. It's not the only thing that they wanted. Okay. A 4-work-day week is something that some people do in France, in other organizations, but also in the UK. That's true. That's why we have to listen to people. That's the case in Iceland. They work 4 days a week. And Belgium is thinking about this. 3,000 companies are doing this in the UK. The town of Lyons in France, Lyon, does that. Absolutely. That's a message that we have to listen to. If we want to keep the youth, we have to give them a reason why they want to come and work for us, but also we have to listen to them because the way they relate to work is totally different nowadays compared to what it was like years ago. So we have to work with HR. And what is it that you call congé d'engagement, an engagement type of leave? Well, the first thing was called congé parenthèse, a parenthesis, that is a stop. That is, every 5 years they can take 3 months off without giving us a special reason. Well, they can aggregate all of their leave days and they can take holidays, and the congé d'engagement is a bit different. Regardless of their levels and jobs in the company? Yes, of course, and we do this throughout the world. So the other one, the congé engagement, the engagement leave, is very important for us because we think it's very important for them to be engaged in the company, but also when they're not working for us. So we have a committee that's going to define the types of associations that they're going to be able to work for, and I'm going to give them days when they can work for these associations. And we have another one called congé accompagnement, a support type of leave, because they have to support their parents or their kins with disabilities, etc. So we do that as well, and that's very important. It's been very positive in the company, and this is based on the fact that we've listened to the employees. Now, Sophie Boissard, we know that with the Ségur de la Santé conference, your industry is improved, but wouldn't you say that the compensation, the pay, is what really matters for any company or a company as big as yours? No. Remuneration and purchasing power, living conditions, I'd say, is of course something that's of paramount importance for our people. But we've realized that the number thing that works is the quality of the company project. The fact that people are proud because they work for something that makes sense, and also their possibility to grow and develop. I'm very happy because now we train people, and this leads to certificates and diploma. It's a promise. We have our own university. We cover the 7 business lines we have. We have 150 different types of diplomas for 7,000 employees and workers. That's what they do. They're trained, and we do support them. We give them special working hours. So this really makes a difference compared to the other companies, because if you look at our business, it's a business that's financed by the French Social Security, and it's the same in other countries where we operate in Europe. And usually the problem is usually the pay. This was the case for teachers as well. No, the pay is one thing, but it's not just the Ségur meetings that were important. Over the past 5 years, we've improved salaries at all levels by something like 25% over the past 5 years. And people don't know that if you take such a job, you can decide more or less what you're going to do. There are many other things you can do. You can work overtime if you want to. So the compensation, the net pay that you're going to get will be, I don't know, 1,500 if you're a beginner, up to 3,000, 3,200 for a nurse. And then there are specialty positions. So we have a whole gamut of compensation packages. And what we pay is well above the average or the mean salary, which means that the first thing that matters for them is not the pay slip. Is it well-being at work? No, I'd say it's because people are interested in the company project, the atmosphere at work, and the management teams as well. For instance, I was thinking about this centre I was in this morning with people with disabilities, 105 people with quite a lot of disabilities. The turnover is 10%. 110 people work there of all ages, lots of trainees, and there's no vacancy. People come and they stay. And the reason is they're really proud because they know how to help and support people with disabilities. They always come up with new projects so that we have the day centres for people with disabilities, or we have other solutions for people who are supported by their families, so that we hive out so that other centres repeat what they've done. If they have to take in people with heavy disabilities, they work with the local community. For children, for instance, there's a big park close to the centre I was talking about to promote the image of people with disabilities and all the biases that people have about handicap in general. Or when there's the local market there, then the people in the community can go and buy something at the local market. And you see this, that what matters for them is not the pay slip at the end of the month. Fairness starts this way, you see. But first, they're proud because they know that what they're working for makes sense. They're proud at their own level, in their own centre. In what they do, they care for people when people are in a fragile position, and they work with others. It's about doing things with others. People enjoy that. It's an engagement. It's a commitment. And, you know, it's like rituals if you are a caregiver, but you can change your rituals and you can help each other out. It's a tiring type of job, probably. Yeah, that's true. And we can't work from home and you can't go halfways about things. You have to be 100% in what you're doing. What you want is a healthy relation with others. Otherwise, you will suffer from a burnout or the equivalent. That's why these jobs cannot be compared with any other job. So what we do, we the managers, we as companies, is that we help these caregivers in our own way. We try and help them and guide them. Now you have a solidarity fund as well to help these caregivers and the nurses because what they do at work might have negative impacts on them. Yeah, that's true. That's one of the many initiatives that we roll out in all of our countries. We have solidarity funds that exist in each of our countries. They are also managed by both the management and our workers. This is what we call good labour industries. So I was saying this fund is a small fund. It's 1 million which is available each year. And together we've defined the 4 or 5 cases when we can give people money. For instance, if their car's down or if someone from the family has died. So, or if someone needs to be repatriated from a country that's far away. These are things that have happened. Or if people can't find a flat quickly. Well, it's the case for many women. Maybe sometimes there's a sense of urgency and we need to help them, or perhaps they're children with diseases and therefore we have to help them. So we don't have that many cases, but at least we have a fund. We have this social organization. We have carers that can give you some type of support, and it really makes a difference. People trust the company. They say, the company I'm working for is not just some type of organization that I'm working for and I'm going to get the pay at the end of the month. There's meaning. That's true. And the company is not going to let you down. That's something very important. In our country, given what we're seeing around us, we want to have this feeling of belonging that we're proud of. And this is our raison d'être, the reason why you want to be on Earth. And it's the support that we provide. I suppose that Jean-Philippe, you would say the same. What do you do in your company, in the agro-food business? How can you give meaning for the people who work for you? I quite agree with you. Well, our business is different, but at least finding people in the agro-food business is not easy. Well, we have everything. As I said, we have the agro-food plus chemicals. But if you ask younger people, they said 92% say, I want to do something that makes sense, that has sense. So with a raison d'être, that's what we do. This objective, this goal is not just about company communication. It has to be a deep cultural change. We have commitments, everybody has their own objectives, the individual objectives, but then it's the thing that people experience day in, day out. What's good about a group is that people have to develop. Each and every single individual has to develop, professionally speaking and personally speaking. Can you measure that? Well, it was complicated to start with. We thought, how can we measure these things? And then we found a way. It's simple. If you poll our people, we did this, for instance, Great Place to Work. We ask people, and we say, for instance, do you feel better this year than last year? The results are out. Well, not for this year, but last year, we were close to the average of Great Place to Work, but 82% of all the people who work for us all around the world have filled out the questionnaire. It's more than the benchmark, which is a good way of measuring things, but it's not easy to measure things, and the numbers keep on changing. But I agree with what was said earlier on, what people expect, what the people want, what employees and workers want, is the human touch. This is something that we're missing. They want to be listened to. They want us to talk to them. We have to find the tools. I was talking about the executive committee for the younger people, but also you have to be open with the other side of industry when you are organizing your labor relations. I'm doing this with the French and the non-French. So that's what you have to organize. Communication at all levels. I was talking about the committee of stakeholders. We have that. We are going to have the alumni in April. We did that with the senior staff. So it's part and parcel of a bigger plan. Therefore, people want to come to April, and then we develop them, and they want to stay with us for 40 years. Good. Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? I know it's a bit hot, more than warm. It's hot, but that's probably a very interesting topic, is it not? Any questions? No, we might have questions later on. Okay. Usually 1 out of 2 people below the age of 35 wants a manual job. And these jobs are not really threatened by AI, I think. So, Jean-Philippe, how do you factor this in your company? Is that something that people want? Well, not really. People don't necessarily want to have a manual job rather than what we'd call the intellectual job. But usually what happens is that people want to be trained for our jobs, for our positions. So that's what we're investing in. We're investing in training so that we have people who are skilled, for instance, in the sales forces. What about you, Sophie? What would you say about this, the manual jobs? Because manual jobs is not something that we usually tend to focus on. But we're in the care business, you see, and rehabilitation, for instance, is a sector where there's a lot of manual things to do. You have to handle people, you have to adjust. All these professions connected to specialized rehabilitation is very much manual, and that's the case for many medical jobs. So what you're saying probably explains why younger people are interested in our sector. That's a bit paradoxical in your industry because there are many candidates, but you don't choose many. I think you asked the public authorities to change the law in France so that we could train more GPs in the future. Is there hope that at last in France we're going to change the system to train general practitioners? Well, you know what? I'd say we've had 8 ministers, health ministers, in 8 years. But since the 70s in France, we've considered that all medical and paramedical jobs had to follow the numerous clause in law. But we pay the price for that, and a dire price. We have fewer GPs that work, not just the doctors, by the way, but also the nurses, the paramedical staff. And if you look at the health indicators in France, they're usually a lot lower than what we can find in the Nordic countries, in Norway. And if you look at GDP expenditure to health expenditure to GDP, they're quite high. So I think we need to react. And this is, I'd say, silly. It's almost criminal. I would use the word. It's criminal. And I hope that the law is going to change in France so that we no longer apply the numerous clauses, so that more people come to us in the care industry, so that we get different profiles. Okay, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for being with us. That was very interesting roundtable. Thank you.
Bonsoir à tous.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really good of you to come here and to talk about savings at this time in the afternoon with the temperature it is, so well done to all of you. So who benefits from savings? That's the question which we're all here to talk about. The jingle wasn't for a detective story, no, it's for our discussion. Who benefits from savings? So I'm part of a generation who learned about this savings at school, and I had to write an essay all about get rich by working and saving. So I have always been interested in savings. Later on, I had an exam at my other school where savings opportunities in the world today, that's a good exam question. And then there was another one. I went to work in banks after that in 2008 when we had the economic crisis, the subprime crisis and then the Lehman Brothers crisis. And at the time we were all very frightened. I worked at the Crédit Agricole. We put some measuring tools to find out whether our savers were taking their money out and putting it in a safe, for example. Instead, we see that savings is a question which affects everybody. And then I worked to the World Bank and had a more macroeconomic approach, analysing savings around the world. In 2015, we all had these Paris agreements about the Sustainable Development Goals. At the time, we said it would be easy and it will cost a few thousand billions, i.e. a fraction of worldwide savings. All we need to do is reallocate a certain percentage of these savings to solve the climate problem. We see today that we are still concerned. I've written a book called Can Finance Save the World? This is one of the questions we'll be broaching today. It's a leitmotif, if you like, that we'll be talking about this afternoon, and it takes me to something which Marie is going to be telling you about in a minute. We want to talk about, so at the end of the day, who benefits from savings? Everybody gets an advantage from savings. Those who do save, those who don't, those who manage savings, those who get their savings managed. And it's La Fontaine said we're all experts when we're talking about savings. So are savings useful to the saver or to their heirs, for example, because you're saving for yourself, but also for your heirs, your children? Does it benefit those who borrow? Does it benefit intermediaries? Does it benefit those who are paid taxes? So there's a lot of ways of talking about savings. I'm not going to say it's a golden subject, it's a bit of an easy play on words there, but we do tend to talk about that. So we say that savings is still a hot topic today. So I can't wrap up without thinking of some big investors. George Soros was asked what is an investment. He said it's speculation that has failed. One can remember, and we'll probably be thinking about this in future weeks, this time it's different. And I have to quote Warren Buffett, who said a lot of things, but I will say two of his things. The number one rule of investment is never to lose money, and second rule is never to forget rule number one. And because we're an X, Warren Buffett said also when someone is sitting in the shade today, it's because somebody took the trouble to plant a tree a long time ago. Over to you, Marie. Thank you very much, Bertrand, for that lovely introduction, full of many points for discussion. So together we have with us today a wonderful panel. I'm going to introduce to you Nicolas Calcon, who's Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Head of Distribution and Wealth Division at Amundi. Then we've got Anna Di Mazzo, Partner and Managing Director of France at Bain & Company. Florence Lustman, you are Chair of France Assureur. Bertrand Rambaud, Chair of France Invest. And Philippe Setbon is Chair of AFG. Thank you very much for being with us today to talk about a subject which is both technical and political, particularly here in France today, as Bertrand pointed out. So, Nicolas Calcoen, can I talk to you first of all? Perhaps we'll set the scene, i.e., savings in France and Europe is very high, as we've been saying, but it's not being invested where it would be most efficient in our economy for future generations, for example. Is this really the case? And what do we do to correct the situation if it's not the case? Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Let me give you a first fragment of a response. Yes, we do have a lot of savings in France in particular, 20% savings rate, which is more or less what we see here in Europe and in the United States. However, do we have too much savings? No, I don't think so, because there are some households which save a lot, but we know that there are loads of households who do not save anything at all. And so, in truth, if you take savings in France, France isn't really a big saver, on the contrary. So, having said that, I believe that there's a question of how we allocate this savings. Where do we invest it? If we take a look at data about French households, 2/3 of savings is in real estate, purchasing property, their home, and we have a little bit of financial savings, but it's usually for safe bets there, very 60% in deposits and life insurance in euros. So there's nothing negative about investing in the deposit accounts or life insurance, nothing negative at all. However, given the rules of liquidity and regulations, that savings naturally is funneled into short-term savings or savings where the rates are not really high enough given the needs that people have in terms of cash flow. So, if we take France, that's what the situation is, and the same thing is more or less around Europe. If we look at the balance of payments, taking a look at Europe, we export savings, i.e. we invest in products of other countries, and we also receive flows to finance our businesses. We purchase American debt, and American pension funds hold or own our businesses. So how can we correct that situation? I think we'll all have a point of view on that. However, I think that we should start from the client need. He needs or she needs security, etc. They want to be helped to invest in the longer term. And so we are led to talk about tax systems and rules and regulations. We need to have a tax system which is coherent with the risk involved in saving. So, savings collected by insurance companies, what is that used for? And who decides how it's used? Is it the saver or is it the insurance company? Well, thank you very much for this question. And let me just react to what you've just said. In a tent across the way, we were opening the room for questions, so I'm going to ask you a question. We insurance companies, we've got 2,300 billion euros of savings, i.e. investments. You have entrusted that money to us. So in your opinion, what is the percentage of shares in that huge amount of money? And I'm sure you're going to get it wrong. You might not get it wrong. Perhaps I should ask 5%, someone's saying? Who's got a better bid than that? Almost 10? Any more suggestions? Don't be shy. Well, I'm not going to wait any longer. The answer is 23%. And if there's one thing, one take-home message today, I want it to be this one. Because no one has ever written that down. Because out of the 2,300 billion, 23% are in shares, 34% bonds, 6% in corporate real estate. So that means 63% is invested in businesses. 24% in sovereign debt, we can't say that it doesn't finance the economy because it does finance public policy. However, I do not understand why people are always saying that we're exactly like a regulated savings. It's not the case. It's the insurance companies that are regulated. So we fund businesses mainly, and we fund the French economy and the European economy. And I would like to thwart preconception. When we talk about France saying we don't fund the economy enough, that's untrue. And people say we're not funding France and Europe enough. 80% of the insurance companies' investments, and my asset manager friends will confirm this, they are invested in France and Europe. It's much less than the pension funds. If you look at the European pension funds, it's under 2/3 which are invested in the Eurozone. So, if there's a take-home message here, it is if you want to fund your economy, businesses, growth, the Eurozone, France and Europe, well, you have to invest in life insurance. And I could say the same thing with figures for Europe from insurance companies. It's an important message. Your second question was who decides? Well, they're both of them. That's the magic of life insurance. We obliged to give advice, and I'm thrilled that we have that obligation. What do the French people ask us? 80% of them want security and easy access to their money. And so you really have to satisfy people's needs. Don't try and be cleverer than they are. However, we've been very clever because we've invented some products such as the Euro Fund, which you've already mentioned. But this Euro Fund is so global, international, that you can have risky investments which are not on the stock exchange, and all kinds of other things in it. And the magic thing about it is that at the end of the day, you've got a product which is not risky at the end because you've got a certain amount of guaranteed capital in the Euro Fund, so that satisfies the client. If they want a bit more risk, then they'll take another product, and 40% of these more risky elements. So the French are starting to take a little bit of risk, and all of those who wish to start to save, we've got this Euro Fund, which can include, because it's such a universal thing, and because it pools everything, it can include very risky investments, and that is why insurance companies are regulated, because they are the ones that carry that involvement risk. They are the ones who take the risk to say, I'm going to diversify my investments so that I can go and get better yield, but at the end of the day, I know that my commitment to my client is to give him or her back that capital which is guaranteed. Have you got that about your preconceptions there? Okay, when we were preparing this round table, you said that the saver has to be satisfied with their savings. So we're talking about investing in the real economy. Are people doing that? Well, let me answer with a question. Do you know how much individual savings we have in the funding of the industry which I represent? 0, 5, 10%, 22, you said 23 earlier. Well, private equity, we're talking about here, we are at 5%. I would just like to come back shortly about why and how we can enhance everything. We have a class of assets which has grown recently. We fund innovation, SMEs, very small industries. So we have 50 billion euros which are invested in the French economy. We have traditionally, since this profession has been around, i.e. 40 years, we've got insurance companies, bankers, and thanks to you, because you're our clients. Without you, we would not be able to fund our professions and the businesses, so let's never forget that. And then, for a certain amount of time now, increasingly we have family offices, we've got entrepreneurs who are investing in our businesses. And more recently, we've seen individual savers thanks to life insurance and pension schemes, etc. But it's a kind of tiny proportion when you compare it with the rest. However, why is this? I think we've all come to the same conclusion. Real assets which are not listed, it's kind of light years away from individual savings, so it's normal. And it's a question of relationship with risk. In France, in particular, people are rather reserved about risk. And there's also a question of distribution, explaining what this class of assets is. It's a bit unique. So I think that we are at the dawn of a huge change. I think we are heading towards progressive change. Yes, it'll all happen very, very slowly. There are some things which are going through here in France, but progressive towards a lot more individual saving. This is a need, of course, for the life of our businesses. I think we've never been at such an important crossroads before in terms of energy, artificial intelligence, data, everything. We need debt, but we also need capital, treasury, capital to be able to do that. I think in a few years' time, if we've got a lot of savings which has not been invested, we're going to need savings to fund the transition. Third point, we're showing that our professions, my job, etc., it is a business that is very high performing and it gives you a lot of cash flow. And that's important as well. So we're about to see these huge changes occur. I'm sure later on we'll talk about how the regulations are changing, and that will foster this evolution. I just want to come back to that first question. There are some very big capital investors who are very well known. They're French, but they're known around the world. They think in the coming years, 20% of their resources will come from individual savers. So I think this is adding a new twist to the story. So let's talk about how the legal framework has evolved. Let's turn to you. So how does one go about changing the legal framework to accommodate these changes and all climate change and all the other transitions we're going through? So how do you get the regulations to evolve? Hello. So AFG, that's who I work for, we represent the companies that manage assets. We work with insurance companies, savers, banks, etc. So we are in constant touch with the French regulator and others in Europe. Regulations are changing, we can talk about that, but I just want to make a quick comment here. The regulatory framework is absolutely fundamental. We need a regulatory framework, particularly in these professions where there are regulations. This framework, if I can draw a parallel with a sporting competition, for example, you've got the outlines of the pitch, you've got the rules of the game, but that's not enough to win. The rules aren't going to help you to score goals. What I'm trying to say is that let's not expect that the rules are going to make investments efficacious. They are simply the means to an end. They don't take you across the finish line. So we want to get regulations to change. Bertrand mentioned this. We all need regulators. They work with us on these changes, the public authorities also, because there are public policies which are translated into regulations. We need to work in a dynamic manner. And I'm thinking here of two major challenges, to be very, very concrete about this. We're talking about transition, energy, digital, all of the other transitions. European regulation today gives us a snapshot. It gives us a framework. It does not define what a transition is. So I am absolutely convinced that if we were to ask everyone here, including us up here on the stage, what is your definition of a transition, we would have as many definitions as we have people in the room. So we want to work on defining the word transition, and how we're going to make that transition. So above and beyond the regulatory framework, which is important because it gets us all off in the same direction, because to speed up transitions, if we've all got different definitions, well, I'll tell you all, our efforts will be scattered all over the place, and our savings, your savings, will be scattered to ineffective vectors because they correspond just to a snapshot. It's the easiest thing in the world today to practice exclusion. That's the easiest thing in the world, but that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We need to be transforming industrial fabric, the production fabric in France, Europe, and elsewhere if possible. The second example is with reference to what you mentioned, Bertrand, the importance of regulations, pushing things forward, driving things forward, so that we can democratize those assets which are not listed. And it's important. It has to be shepherded along. It's not spontaneous. The stakes are high, stakes in terms of cash flow and stability for the sailors, who we all are, individually speaking. Savings is like an aggregate of national accounting, or we can look at it like that, but in fact it's the sum total of all our individual savings. That's how we have to look at it. And that is why Nicolas was talking about clients and savings at the service of the client. So the regulations must evolve in that particular direction. So Ada Di Mazzo, a question for you. And it's, can one educate people about saving? Can you teach savers how to save? Can you heighten their awareness about saving? I'm absolutely convinced that this is a key question. Earlier on, we were talking about energy transitions, digital transition. We're talking about investment, taxonomy. The challenge of teaching savers is absolutely key, because if we want to earmark savings for these different things to fund socially crucial elements, well, we need to teach on three different things. First of all, we have to make the offers comprehensible. When I mentioned earmarking savings for the energy transition, only 10% of savers have heard about any offerings which would correspond to that. So you can see what the biggest challenge is. Then, even when you've got half of your clients, you have to make sure they understand what the offers are. Half of the clients who are saving here in France would like to invest in vehicles for environmental transition, but there's only a fraction of those people actually purchasing those products. So they need to understand the product, the nature of the product, and some products are going to be a bit more risky, so it needs education. And in the English-speaking world, this is much more developed. And to a lesser degree, once you understand where your savings are going, you need to know how it's going to perform, who's going to use it, and is it going to be used by the people we're hoping is going to be used it. So that's all part of the teaching process as well. We have to make sure people understand all of this. The good news is that, yes, the stakes are in terms of human beings, and in the savings distribution networks, it's the key factor, i.e. the human being, your advisor. The advisor's ability to listen to what you want, to advise you, to guide you towards the right product. And most savers would like to have an advisor who advises them. The second thing is, each time they see their advisor, 9 times out of 10, they're very, very happy. The satisfaction level in the distribution network has never been so high in France, not for 10 years. So it's optimistic, but we need to simplify, we need to explain, but the good news is that it all boils down to the human being, and we can invest in that. So Florence, are the French averse to risk? And can you tell us a little bit about risk linked to transition? Well, first of all, I'm going to talk about transition, because here we're talking about finance and funding, but an insurance company is the one who covers the risk, and there can be consequences to climate risk. We work alongside by you, those people who are insured by us. For decades now, they've been suffering the consequences of weather events. They're said to be extraordinary, but they're becoming more frequent. We have forecast over the next 30 years the cost of weather events will double. Drought, for example, could treble in the next 30 years. And so people are becoming very aware of this, because every time there's a flood or there's a cyclone, as we've seen in the hinterland behind Nice quite recently, those things are impossible to predict. And the media report about them a lot. So the French are now fully aware. There are surveys which confirm this. Over 80% of the population has understood that climate risks are going to increase, what with climate change. Now, I agree with what has just been said about educating people about risk. When you ask people, are you prepared? Have you got any information? Have you gone to look on the website of France Assureur? Because we give you lots of information about what action you must take if there's a risk of flood. And do you know what your local risks are? And if you're in the mountain, or if you're by the coast, or if you live in a flood zone near to a forest which might go up in flames, there are only half of the people who we question who've taken the bother to find out what the principal local risk is for them. So there's huge room for manoeuvre here in how we can educate people, educate them about risk, climate risk. And now I think there's a national day devoted to resilience. It's the 13th of October, and we want to make sure that this day is unrolled on a local event, so that private people, but also businesses and local councils, we want them all to get to grips with the most likely risks in their zone, because whenever there is a huge event, very sadly, behavior, when people are stressed, they do inappropriate things. For example, in a flood, people will get into their car to drive to the school to collect their children, but their roads are flooded and things. And if someone goes down into their cellar where the cellar is already flooded. So I agree with you. Yes, it's a question of reinsurance somehow. We have a lot of innovation, a lot of new technologies which we insurance companies are funding to adapt our buildings and our behavior to global warming. But there are always human beings in the loop, and we human beings, we all need to learn more about how we should behave with increased climate risks. And I'd just like to round off by saying that for savings, yes, and I was surprised to hear that 60% do see their advisors. I think they simply need to turn up on the doorstep of the bank, and they will be shown into an advisor's office. But 70% of the life insurance contracts have amount under 70,000 euros. So you will have an advisor who'll be able to guide you in the right direction. And a lot of people say they need to give some meaning to their savings. It's beyond the transitions. They are looking for meaning, and we answer that because over 90% of investments with insurance companies are subject to different ESG criteria. And so when you've got over 5,000 euros to invest, you're better off investing in a guaranteed product. But if someone's got more to invest, they can put some of their savings in a euro fund, and there's a whole range of accounts that will be useful. Some focus on biodiversity, some focus on climate equilibrium, etc. So I'm slightly surprised by your figure of 100%, because to me it seems that most advisors, certainly in the insurance and banking sectors, they are going to give advice to any saver who comes along. So they want to have advice. That means they're getting it. They can't do without savings.
Nicola Galli. In light of everything that we have said, can we have an influence on savings flows? I think so, yes. With different elements and different types of answers could be combined with that. First of all, this is our responsibility in every savings industry sector that we represent, namely to design straightforward products that can be understandable, that could be not costly, cost-effective with advisors. The advisory services can take the form and shape of various kinds. We have to make people aware, we have to make savers aware that when they have a long-term horizon, it would be meaningful to take more risks if it's done in a diversified way, reasonable way. Obviously, we should have a tax and regulatory framework that is appropriate. I like the comparison with the soccer pitch framework parallel. I think it's very good. It needs to favor, we need to favor more risky but longer term products that would benefit the customer. When we use the weapon of taxation, it can be legitimate to be conditioned if we require important savings in Europe to have those benefits. That's the case, actually. It's maybe less the case in other countries in Europe. But another element that could have an influence and that could help us gear the needs that we might have in France, in Europe, in other countries, we need financial industry stakeholders in France and Europe that are strong, robust, that are competitive. And that can be found when we see the proportion of assets, savings geared towards European assets. When they're managed by European managers, it's stronger, it's more robust than when it is managed by American stakeholders, and some of them are actually present in our countries. Bertrand Robot, we are going to look ahead. Maybe they are in the room. We're going to look ahead and look beyond our borders. So what do we see in terms of difference between the US and ourselves? And can we imagine a European ecosystem that could be compared to that of the US? Just to give you a few figures, I told you earlier that the individual savings in private equity would be 5%. In the US, it's 50%. The ratio related to the GDP between US and Europe, it's 2.5% plus. Well, we can shed light on the reasons for this. Should we go towards this direction? I don't think so. Each country has its own culture. Will we go into that direction? I don't think so. Not overnight anyway. And we should look into the characteristics. We have savings culture, investment culture, and the Americans are not a single model. It's just interesting to see the evolution, the developments that took place there. How can we change? We can say, okay, we're convinced that change is about to happen, but how? We could say, okay, tomorrow it's going to be 10% or more in terms of midterm goals. I'm talking about private equity once more. I'm talking about my own industry sector. We talked about the regulatory framework. I would like to be more precise. In France, we have the PACT law, the green industry law, and the implementing decree was just enacted earlier on, 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, which is good because it will help to get closer to individual savings, and it will integrate it in the culture. What we should, the takeaway message, in my opinion, if there's one, that's the one. We have the opportunity today as an individual saver with 1,000 euros to have access to a fund in which there will be a lot of family offices and a lot of institutionals, thanks to life insurance and to retirement fund. that means that there's an alignment of interest, that what we're looking for big institutions and big or family offices, it will be the same as for private individuals. Everybody in the end will be happy. It's maybe straightforward, but the person investing must be happy and satisfied with the yield, with the investment. We have a few obligations, however. You talked about educational obligation. Of course, this is very significant because not everyone is acquainted with private equity investment. When you have 5,000 euros to invest, don't go towards private equity. That will be a first thing to say. We have to understand what this class of assets is. They are very wonderful things. We follow some companies' paths that are tremendous. This is what gives me a thrill, actually. And we can see it in the investment. But we need time. Cash flow is more complicated, so we need to understand that it may be more difficult to have available assets. And with France Invest, we have a training school where we teach distributors what our trade is all about, what the characteristics are, what are the drawbacks, and what are also the benefits. I would like to talk about the cost of distribution, because not everything is free. Where there's management fees, of course, that is paid out by funds, by everyone, family offices, institutionals, but also the individual savers. And if the individual saver has access to it, it is because there's a distribution cost. We hear a little bit of everything and anything, really. They say it's going to cost twice as much as it cost before. It's not true. We made some surveys about the cost, and we managed to find 0.8 of the annual costs in our funds. But we need to actually make collective efforts to try to stronghold everything. We need to make sure that these individual savings is satisfied, and we need to give good education and to make sure that the costs do not ramp up, so that we can do the investment. That's really what is important. That's where the rubber hits the road, and this is what we have to respect. We have to respect this roadmap. That is really important. Philippe Sebaud, I see you react to what has been said by Bertrand Rimbaud, especially on the American side. I would like to say to you, should we have a specific European system? A better European organization? A specific European system? Well, we already have it. I'm talking as president of ANG. I'm also in charge of a significant management company whose significant portion of turnover comes from the US. We also have a European component. That means that regulation dictates all of our actions. What do you mean by European approach? It may not be the same. Okay, if you want. But, you know, the facts are there. The proof is in the pudding. So, one day, we should look and compare in an objective way the efficiency of the two models. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but maybe we should have some objectivity in the way in which we see the impact of each system. Should we go forward with European-specific features? Yes, we have a specific approach. We should fine-tune it. We should delve into it. But, I would like to give you a few elements that feed our discussions with the European authorities and regulators, which are the following. In Europe, we were talking about security, prices, different components, adjustment, obviously. Now, for 40 years now or more in Europe, any regulatory development, it may be the case in this industry, but in any other industry as well, their aim is to protect the consumer. So we have to understand, how can we educate the consumers? How can we help them make the right decisions that are suitable for their profile, for their circumstances? And we have to protect the consumer at all costs. The consumer whom we're talking about and whom we want to protect at all costs is also a salaried employee, an entrepreneur, a retiree, or someone who's a member of the working population. So this consumer has all interest for us to work on the competitiveness of industry, and this is why we need to set up a virtuous circle in this direction. So regulation, we're working on it consistently in a vibrant way, but we should not lose the idea of having a competitive world for such companies. Otherwise, the consumer will continue to consume things from outside because performance, high yield is elsewhere. It's not in Europe anymore. So, Anani Marceau, before giving the floor to the audience, because of course we're going to have a Q&A, I would like to speak with you briefly on what Bertrand has just said in the introduction about future generations. Should they take on board the future generations when we're talking about savings? I like your question very much, because when we talk about savings, it seems very technical, but it's a matter, it's an issue which is important for the society at large. So we should enter into a collected but also a committed savings era. It is important for me. When you see the savings ratio of people under 30-year-olds, it's 8%. But the savings ratio for people over 70, it's 25%. And actually, that's where there is a contradiction in our society. Savings should be the common denominator between the two generations, because otherwise we can't have new generations that cannot allow themselves to become entrepreneurs, to create new companies. This is why the industry has a lot at stake, because savings needs to have a purpose. It needs to be earmarked to concrete projects. We have a lot of things at stake: the infrastructures, reindustrialization, entrepreneurship. Everything is at stake. Should it lie only in the hands of the financial industry? No. It should be in the hands of everyone. This is where the ecosystem needs to change everywhere and work hand in hand with all the stakeholders. Questions, sir, you have the floor. Hello, Eisenberg, OSS Ventures. In '93, I was the general rapporteur of this commission of Dessange entrepreneurs to set up the program for the presidential elections that brought Chirac to become a president. We said so many things. I co-signed this report with Mr. Perrault from BNP, director of BNP, and later on he was the director of BNP Paribas. And we said we should gear savings towards productive activities, companies, and there are two things to do: life insurance, and there are things that actually surprised me, I have to say, and retirement funds. Second thing, I was interviewed 2 months ago by Trésor before the dissolution, and I told them this, exactly this, and they said no, political decision makers are not ready. Management industry should not go into that direction, and it is necessary if we want to exist as European, as French company managers. We need to create retirement funds. So how do we get that? How do we reach that point? Thierry Hulot from l'entreprise des médicaments Groupe Merck in the pharmacy world. It is suggested to take all the Frenchmen's savings to reimburse the debts. What is your opinion about this? We should not talk about elections and electoral topics. That's what we were told. Another question Maybe you could answer to these two questions before having a second round. On the magic of retirement funds, on pension funds, you know there were a lot of discussions with market unions, capital market. Do you know what capital market union is? That's the union of capital markets. That's a European project, a European reflection that is starting again. And we were thinking of having a union of capital markets in Europe. And one of the reflections that went out is we do not fund companies enough, the real world, with our savings. And so we looked for figures. And this is why I can give you the percentage on equity, even though we've published it for decades now. What struck me, what surprised me, is there are two subjects. We should fund real economy, but also we should fund it in Europe. And I was quite surprised to see that in countries where there are pension funds, I'm talking about the Netherlands or the Nordic countries, where the leak of savings towards the US, when we look at the figures, it's because of the pension funds. But also, as you said, because of stakeholders that are American, management companies that are American. And I think that our French asset managers know the French market, so they have priority. They are better to invest in French companies, but when we have American asset managers talking about how to manage assets in Europe, they talk about the market that they know best, and actually it's the American market, obviously. 2, 3 elements. We carried out a recent survey in May. It was published in June with ING about allocation of assets carried out by different management companies. And this is actually demonstrated and shown in our publication. So I would invite you to check this website out. It will be actually updated very soon in September, and you can check it out on our website. This allocation, which would favor French companies and American companies, that's one thing. Secondly, I wanted to go back to your pension fund input. But anyway, we have worked upstream of the PAC law, and this had an impact on the PAC law. I'm looking at our AFG friends. In '96, we worked on Pillar 3 of the law. We're not talking about pension funds, but rather retirement scheme funds. And I did take note of your question. When we talk about savings aggregate, that is sum of individual savings. That's not a national savings. That's not national savings. So what we wanted to do is to look into the duration of investment as suitable for each need. We have short-term needs, mid-term, and long-term needs, depending on our life projects. And the savings products are tailored to those needs. They are actually offered by insurance companies, and they were quite successful. And I would urge you to check the products out, because they're very suitable. We are working hard to give a lot of offer, a wide range of products for any kind of type of savings. I don't know if pension funds are the solution, but we need to have long-term solutions. Savings exist, of course. In our trade, there is something that is important, which is that we need to have a good intermediary salability. We need to have availability of cash, because people cannot be committed for too long a period of time. And if the industry manages to facilitate secondary transactions, to have more fluidity, to make it easier to sell products and to have the available cash, then we will open wide the door of such assets and to the companies that it addresses. There's a lot at stake, And it's important for an individual, a family, they cannot commit for a period that is too long. And there are insurance companies that cover these, that hedge these products behind that. And they have a lot in place. So we're fully aware of that. And the current period of time, the current circumstances with rates that are higher, with less available cash. The liquidity is important. It was found too easily over the last years, and we now have to have a more structuring approach, because this is an important challenge ahead of us. Thank you. And I would like to say that nobody thinks that it's saving is for dummies. Are there any other questions? Bertrand has written down everything during our debate. And so now we're going to wrap up, and you're going to give us the gifs. You didn't save anything from us, right? Yeah, that's easy. No pun intended. So it was hard for us to gather at such high temperatures to talk about a difficult, daunting subject. In a way, if I could be mischievous to wrap up, this subject would rehabilitate the expression at the same time. Because at the same time, it's a technical subject, as you have seen, but it's also a sensitive subject. We combine in our answers our individual reasoning. We say, what does it mean for us? But what does it mean for the world as well? We mix the micro and the macroeconomics. We talk about supply and demand, and we can't take them apart. Nicolas has said rightfully that we talk about private and public savings. They're not non-communicating. We talk about solvency and illiquidity. We talk about short and long-term horizons. And we go back to the important question that I had to address in 1901. That's the balance between savings and investment. We talk about institutions and individuals, and we hope that the interests will converge, which is not easy. We talked about thousands of euros on the one side and thousands of billions of euros on the other side. Each of us, we are a saver, a consumer, a salaried employee, an entrepreneur, a retiree. So we have to find meaning in all of this. That's the first point. That remains a complicated subject that is important to all of us. Nobody has no idea because we're all concerned individually. Secondly, we've talked about savings and figures. We've been given some figures that are important, and I will repeat it. 23% of equity for insurance companies and 23% for investment in real economy, 5% in private equity, 50% in the US. But we are on the road to 25%. Thirdly, we haven't talked about figures only, and that's a good thing. We've talked about education, and we wondered, what about human beings? You've talked about being human. That's not a bad word, and I thought it was very nice because we haven't talked about artificial intelligence. I thought it was about to be mentioned, but we talked about real, full-fledged human beings that would provide advisory services. It remains at the heart of human beings. The question was asked several times, and it is essential. It's important to remind ourselves that saving is not a matter of product, of regulation, not only a matter of taxation, not only a matter that it's not that we have rules. We need a team. We need enthusiasm, and all these human components are often neglected, and we should talk about it. And I'm glad we drifted towards that subject. It's not a disconnected debate because we're affected by everything that would impact the economy for obvious reasons, because public economy would affect savings. You talked about political circumstances. They affect also our savings. The US would also affect savings. The American debt, obviously, when I'm talking about the US, I'm talking the American debt. That everything is actually embedded. And this is a subject, as said, that connects the worlds. all universals. And you will see in the proposal made by the CEP, there's one regarding that subject, which is important, on how can we secure with national and European guarantees a more risky saving. And it's my privilege to wrap up with a takeaway message in 20 seconds to go, with a more personal note. I'm not surprised. You will not be surprised by what I'm going to say. We've had a reasoning that is very geared toward France and Europe. And this is the way in which we operate nowadays. We thought about France, France towards Europe, France towards the US. We never thought about what I'm going to say. We never wondered about the impact, and we never wondered about the rest of the world. I always go back to that question that I found really, really daunting. The balance between savings and investment should be analyzed at the scale of France, Europe, the world, the rest of the planet, the whole planet. It is time to push back the horizons in our reflection on savings, and we should overcome these borders, and we should think about saving that is at the scale of the planet as a whole. Otherwise, we will not reshape our planet, and things will go south, and it will be the same for the rest of the world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the rest of the round table and for all of those that have followed it and listened to it. Thank you.